Shall I go? Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Environment Committee meeting. The main item on the agenda is a discussion on noise pollution in London with our guests. However, we have some short items of business first. Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag #AssemblyEnvironment for this meeting. Please may I remind everyone to switch phones to silent mode and ask that members and guests ensure that electronic devices are not placed in front of their microphones. Can I now ask our clerk if any apologies have been received?
No apologies have been received.
Thank you very much, Anna. Declarations of interest, section 2. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Noted. Thank you very much. Section 3, minutes. Can we confirm the minutes of the Environment Committee meeting held on 28th of June 2022 and the notes of the informal meeting held on 19th of July 2022 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. Section 4, summary list of actions. Can I ask the committee to note the completed and outstanding actions arising from previous meetings and additional correspondence received? Noted. Thank you. Section 5, Mayor's response to clean air for all Londoners. Can I ask the committee to note the response from the Mayor of London to the Clean Air for All Londoners report? Noted. Thank you. We now move on to our main items of business, a discussion with invited guests on noise pollution in London. We will be joined in the chamber by Charlotte Clark. She's running late, but when she arrives, she is Professor of Epidemiology, Population Health Research Institute, St George's University. And we are joined in the chamber by Duncan Weir, Head of Track Transport for London, TfL, welcome, and Sam Longman, Head of Sustainability and Corporate Environment, also from TfL, welcome both. Via Zoom, I would like to welcome Lucy Hayward-Speight, Transport Strategy and Policy Manager for Transport for London, and Neil Smith, Campaigner for Tube Noise. Thank you both for joining us today also. So, we will kick off with the first question, which I'm actually going to hand over to Joanne for, because Charlotte isn't in the chamber. Sorry, I'm going to ask the second question, which is to Lucy Hayward-Speight, who is on Zoom. Sorry, Lucy, that was flawless. Lucy, how robust is the data available on noise from road traffic in London, and are there any gaps in this data?
Hello, sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yes, loud and clear. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, actually for this question, can I refer to Sam? I think he's going to be answering this one, thanks.
No problem at all. Sam, off you go.
Thank you very much. Okay, so our primary source of noise pollution data is the DEFRA noise modelling, which they do regularly, and the last round was round 3 in 2017. That actually maps noise across the transport network and exposure for the entirety of our network, and it's based on inputs particularly in terms of traffic volumes and traffic makeup. In terms of gaps, we don't have permanent noise monitors, which I think is something that you'd be interested in, primarily because we don't see that there'd be a value in them compared to, say, permanent air quality monitors, where air pollution is particularly impacted by changes in weather, wind and temperature, whereas noise is, because it's so tied to the nature of the traffic, it doesn't really change, and therefore there wouldn't be alerts, and there'd also be limited action which you would take if there was high noise on a particular road, because really in the short term all you've got is traffic management, essentially closing the road, and I think that wouldn't be the right approach or response to spikes in noise.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to Assembly Member McCartney.
Thank you. And I'm asking questions of Lucy, if I can. Lucy, what are the major road traffic hotspots in London, and what is TfL doing about them? And in that, can I ask you how you work out what are the noise hotspots? Do TfL measure noise or not?
I'm really sorry, but I'm going to hand this one back to Sam. I'm going to be covering the more strategic level, sort of Mayor's policy side of things. Okay. But Sam can do that one. Thank you.
That's fine. Thank you.
Thank you. So the DEFRA noise mapping actually identifies noise important areas in London, which are essentially the hotspots. There are a lot of them, and they range from kind of particular spots to lengths of roads. And we can provide you a link to where that data is publicly available, including the noise important areas, and you can see a map.
I think we've got the map, yeah.
Yeah, and you'll see from your map, it looks very similar to the air pollution concentration map, and that's because that is also linked to traffic. So as part of the round 4 mapping, which is underway now, and we're working directly with the consultants to help them in terms of providing data input they need, they will be updating those noise important areas across London.
But do a TfL on your own roads, do you measure noise levels at all? Because it seems to me that if you're taking steps to alleviate noise, you need to know whether it works or not.
No. Yeah, so as I say, we don't have permanent noise monitors. The best data available is the DEFRA modelling, particularly if you're looking at longer term policies. If we're doing construction activity, we may, depending on the nature of the construction, install temporary noise monitoring, but we don't have permanent noise monitors. And Lucy will come on to this in terms of our response to tackling noise is very much around a mode shift, switching to cleaner vehicles, encouraging walking and cycling. So essentially that is our best tool for having a lasting and high impact on reducing noise in London.
Okay, so it's obviously an aim of the Mayor to reduce noise from traffic. But I suppose the obvious question is, how do you know it works? So there's the DEFRA information, but unless you specifically measure it on an ongoing basis, how do you know that schemes such as bus electrification or the ULEZ actually does work in that regard to reduce noise?
Well, I think the issue is the changes that we would bring about would have a very marginal impact on a case-by-case basis. So, if, you know, we don't do a lot of schemes where we're, say, building new lanes of road or a whole new road in particular. So there wouldn't be a significant change. What we really need to target is that gradual change over time, and that's why the policies that we have in the Mayor's transport strategy around mode shift, around cleaning vehicles, around promoting walking, cycling, will have a gradual impact. And the only way to really assess that is that modelling data that is updated every few years by DEFRA. So I know that's kind of disappointing in that you potentially would like us to have a more urgent and up-to-date approach, but as I think I said earlier, I just don't think it would tell you anything more than you don't already know from the DEFRA noise mapping, because essentially it is about traffic volumes and it's about the makeup of the traffic. So if we're reducing traffic volumes, if we are encouraging newer vehicles which tend to be quieter, particularly electric vehicles, we will see an improvement over time in noise.
Okay, thank you. Can I also ask you, I went on a site visit yesterday to a stretch of the North Circular Road in Enfield, where it appears that there's a Thames water leak under the surface, which keeps disrepairing the road. And TfL say they want to resurface it,
yes,
but they can't do until the underlying cause is alleviated. But they've had no great response from Thames Water.
Okay.
So can I ask, and residents have potholes, they're patched, but they keep reappearing, and so we were there particularly around noise yesterday at this road. How good is TfL at working with partners and perhaps prioritising schemes where noise is the issue as opposed to perhaps other categories that you would normally use?
Yeah, I mean, well, generally we work very closely with the statutory undertakers and the utility providers, but clearly there's challenges, and you've highlighted one there. So it's not always perfect, but we do aim to target roads that are in need of urgent repair, particularly if they're unsafe. And I think particularly if the road is starting to degrade in the way that you described, that sounds like quite an important matter that we need to deal with. So it's obviously known to my colleagues, but I will take that back after this discussion.
Thank you. The other question I wanted to ask you is that there are trials now of acoustic cameras. Government's, I think, funding some parts, and I think one of the West London, I think it's Tony, one of your councils, is also installing acoustic cameras. And I have an issue in my own patch on the A10 near Edmonton, Winchmore Hill, where, you know, particularly late at night, often young men racing vehicles with unmuffled exhausts. And I was disappointed that TfL didn't actually bid to be part of a pilot scheme, but you do say you're looking at that. Is that something that you would look to install in future if if it works?
Yeah, so we're aware of the DFT scheme and we're aware of Kensington and Chelsea as well, and I think we're also working with them to site a couple of their cameras on our road network, and we very much want to see what the results of those are and how useful they are. The responsibility for enforcement is the local authority and police, and I understand that Kensington and Chelsea have introduced a public protection order. So it is something we'll look at, but I won't commit at this stage to install a network of those acoustic noise monitors. We'll want to see how they work. With regards to racing, that is a particular problem, and the local police and the Roads and Transport Policing Command do undertake operations for car meets and street racing. Often they can happen at very short notice, publicised through social media, so it can be challenging, but I do understand that they have some good techniques they're employing at the moment. When it comes to police enforcement, what they will focus on is the most dangerous behaviour. So that's often speeding and dangerous driving, which will tend to be the cause of the loud noise, or, for example, as you've described, vehicles that are illegally modified. Rather than the noise itself, is getting to the root cause of what is causing the noise. And I do understand that street racing and modified loud cars is a particular problem.
Okay, but I'm glad you're going to look at it, and I'll hold you to that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Best.
Thank you, Chair. I think the question number 4 was asked.
Okay.
So, yeah.
In that case,
so I'll go. I'll go on, but I'm just so you don't. But yeah. So just the next question was also to
Charlotte, who's not here. So
I'll just my own supplementary.
Perfect.
Just I want to make you think, understand where I am. So I just wanted to ask, in regards to the current expansion of the Edmonton incinerator in in Enfield, which you might be familiar with. There's a struggle here for the local community, not only in relation to the construction noise, but also the concern about an increased road traffic noise coming from the lorries that may well be needed in the future to support that district heating network. Is this something that TfL can commit to keeping an eye on and looking at in relation to both the road traffic noise from the construction vehicles and from the large refuse vehicles?
Apologies, I can't speak to that scheme in particular, but I will speak in general terms about how we approach development and changes on the network. So for a lot of our own construction work, it's done under permitted development, but what we will do with all of our projects is we'll undertake an environmental impact assessment to assess if there's any issues, and that includes noise. And we'll also look to see whether that requires any kind of mitigation. If it's significant enough, we will undertake an environmental impact assessment, and we will look to implement measures to reduce the adverse impact, and that could be around traffic management, around timings, around noise barriers, for example. So I definitely will take that away and have a look at a bit more depth at that project that you're talking about.
Thanks, Sam. Could I ask, perhaps, and TfL have looked at this before, but can I perhaps ask for an update provided to this committee on your assessment of the noise mitigation needed at that site?
Of course, yeah.
Thank you. I was also going to ask about the camera scheme, but so me and Joe are clearly on the same wavelength today. And my other questions were for Charlotte, so if I could come back
yeah,
later.
absolutely. So anyone who had questions for Charlotte, when Charlotte arrives, we'll have to mix up the agenda a bit, but we'll go back to where we were. Assembly Member Buckhari, I've got you. Okay, fair enough. In that case, I'm going to propose that we move to the next section, which is about tube noise, but we will move back to road traffic noise once Charlotte arrives. So on tube noise, I'm going to hand over to Assembly Member Devenish.
Well, this is my mastermind specialist subject, Chair. I think cross-party we've been pushing on this for 6 years. I'll pay tribute to TfL for what they're doing, but there's much, much more they need to do. And it's right, rather than going straight to TfL, we want to hear from the community. So Neil Smith, you're down as a tube noise campaigner. Thank you for what you're doing in the community, because it's so important that we keep on raising the issue of tube noise.
Sorry to interrupt you. You're doing brilliantly, but Neil hasn't actually joined us yet. So everything you just said about wanting to hear from the community first is correct, but he's not here.
Well, it's one of those days, isn't it? I'm going to blame the weather now and the British summertime weather. So
I know it's the week of U-turns, but actually he is with us. He's just connected by telephone.
Neil,
so as you
good morning, Neil, and thank you for all you're doing. Do you want to say a little
Hello.
bit about you and your bit of London, and then answer the question, please, which is, what impact is tube noise having on Londoners, please?
Okay. I'm sorry I can't get it to work on the video and everything, so I'm on the phone. Well, I'll be as brief as I possibly can. Our problem started in 2015, 2016. We have 72 trains going under our houses every hour. And what happened in 2015-16 was suddenly we actually could hear the tube.
Neil, do you want to say where you are to start with? Neil, do you want to say exactly where you are?
Okay. Okay, the address is Cloudsley Street in Islington, N1.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. So we're between Highbury and Islington and King's Cross. And my wife and I live in a 4-story house, which suffered from very slight noise, which was white noise, when we moved into it in 2014. 2015-16, the noise increased. We could suddenly hear both tracks. And then neighbours started talking about the problem.
To try and move your
They were
mobile
suffering
phone
from-
away from your Zoom connection, it may help.
Sorry, what?
We're getting really bad feedback, Neil. If you can
Okay.
try and move your mobile
that it?
phone away from your Zoom, it may help.
Okay, done it. Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Is that better?
Very good,
Okay.
thank you.
I've just switched it off. So the noise started increasing very substantially. We didn't understand why. We contacted TfL. We didn't get any answers. We contacted Jeanette Arnold. She took up our cause and called the first meeting at the end of 2016. We still didn't get any satisfaction from TfL. We did get satisfaction on very localized issues, cracked tracks and things like that, but nothing else. So nothing happened. So then we jumped to 2018 when TfL told us that they would be replacing all the rails and sleepers on our section of the track, so northbound and southbound, between Highbury and Islington and King's Cross. And what they did was they did that, we assume. The trouble is that whatever rails they chose, it made the noise worse. So everything's getting worse and worse and worse. In our house, we could hear both tracks, trains running under our house, and the noise was going from the lower ground floor all the way up, 3 floors up. We could hear the noise, and the first tubes were now waking us up in the morning. Just to give you some idea of, it's sort of anecdotal, but another resident described the noise by the end of 2019 as a vacuum cleaner going through his home 72 times an hour. So you can imagine what that was like. And you have to imagine that we were fortunate, or we are fortunate, we have 4 floors of a house. Some people live in basement flats or first floor flats. People have families. They were suffering terribly from all this noise. That changed with the arrival of Heidi Alexander in late 2019. There was a total change of attitude. All of a sudden, and Duncan Weir, I think he's on this call. He was also involved in this change of attitude, and Heidi Alexander, over a number of meetings with us and with Jeanette Arnold, agreed to grinding the tracks in our area every 6 months and meeting with us every 6 months, which has been done since April 2020. And we are immensely grateful for the relief that that's given us, because a vacuum cleaner going through your living room 72 times a day is not a very pleasant thing. But the people who really suffered are obviously the families who have gone through this very, very difficult period. Now we have relief, and we hope that's going to continue. At our last meeting, now with Seb Dance, who has replaced Heidi Alexandra, and Sem Moema, who has replaced Jeanette Arnold, TfL told us that they would be moving to only grinding the tracks every year. There's more detail to that, but obviously we are very, very concerned that might happen. I think one of the things to say about this whole period, because we're talking about a 4-year period before we got any serious action by TfL, and now we're 6 years on. One of the things that is very, very frustrating is the lack of sharing of data with us. Because we have our experience, we have our apps which measure the decibels and things, but TfL has a lot of data and are very reluctant to share it with us. So we have conversations where, and I don't want to overly criticize TfL because they've done a fantastic job since April 2020, but the conversation goes along the lines, we have data that shows, therefore we conclude that. And I'm being oversimplistic here. And we residents on the other side, and my group is over 100 homes in our area, we're saying, yes, but we are experiencing it. We know what happens when you stop grinding. And when you change the model of rails that you put in the tube. So that's an ongoing discussion, but we're extremely grateful for what's being done. It hasn't taken us back to the level of noise that we were experiencing, which was very mild at the beginning of 2016, but it's hugely, hugely better. We'd like it to be even better, and we're talking about deep tube reconditioning, but that costs an absolute fortune, and I think the financial situation of TfL doesn't allow it to be extended to our area just yet.
Thank you very much, Neil. That was really helpful. All those things you've said, really, I think most of us have got residents with similar issues. I'm going to hand over back because my next question, the person hasn't arrived yet. But if I could just say, there is a meeting of all Assembly members with the mayoral team and TfL straight after the next mayoral questions. And I hope at that meeting we're going to have a lot of solutions, not just track grinding, which ameliorates the problem but doesn't sort it out. And can I finally say, and I'll be quiet and let somebody else speak, Duncan, there's another letter coming from Lady Moy Scott of Pimlico, who's one of my main residents, and if you could, it came the other day, if you can make sure you've read it before the meeting after mayoral question and got a response, I would be incredibly grateful. I'll hand back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Clark.
Thank you, Chair. Just following on from that, Neil's story, as Tony indicated, is similar to many of the emails that I certainly receive from my constituents in Barnet and Camden. I know Leonie receives them. I mean, we are constantly inundated, and it's the suffering of these residents is very difficult to explain until you've actually met with them. But their lives are permanently disrupted. A lot of them feel they can't move, they can't sell their flats, and they're in very, very difficult situations, and they're not sleeping. So I'm just wondering if TfL know how many residents are living in a situation where they are suffering from tube noise that's above the WHO recommended levels, and have these numbers changed over time?
I don't have the numbers to hand. We do record all complaints, and I can provide you the data for that. But that will be only a proportion of the people who are probably impacted by tube noise, and we are very cognizant of that. What we rely on is people to raise concerns about the tube noise, and it tends to be a change of noise that's experienced within their properties. And that actually usually indicates there's been a change of the condition of the track in proximity to their property, and then we use that to carry out some target interventions on the track to then reduce the noise back to the level that some properties will, through the proximity of the property to the infrastructure, are inevitably going to experience some form of noise because of the energy that's being created in the tunnels by the rolling stock. It's just about trying to control that noise to the lowest practicable level that we can. So that's why we have a number of hotspot areas. There are a number of residents who are more active than others about bringing concerns to us, and we carry out regular measurements within those properties. We have improved over the last 3 to 5 years, and we have a better understanding about how the causes of noise are actually formed. Most of it's to do with the condition of the rail and the way that we actually operate our infrastructure. So certainly within the Victoria line, that we have a high intensity metro. We have something called corrugation that's formed on the rails through the acceleration and deceleration of trains, which is called corrugation. It looks like a corrugated roof. You look at it from the side profile. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't hit the microphone. And that causes the train to micro-bounce, for want of a better word, and then that then creates additional energy. And what we're trying to do is reduce the amount of corrugation on the rails, and that then reduces the additional energy that's been formed. So that's for something, for Neil, what he's articulating is there is a change in the level of noise, which is invariably we can then link that directly to the change in the levels of corrugation in the rails close to their properties. So we then grind those rails back to as smooth as we possibly can, and then the noise then reduces as a consequence of that.
So are you keeping track of these complaints over time?
Do.
So I mean, so if people complain and then sort of give up, because I think sometimes people do, and then they sort of stop. You're not closing these complaints. They remain open, and additional complaints
we
are added
work
to them.
on an initiative process. So people raise a complaint. I have a team of 5 acoustic engineers who work for me. They go to the property, we arrange an appointment, and they carry out in situ measurements. And that then allows us to target the specific issue they might be experiencing. The one that's probably most noticeable to residents is impulsive noise, and that's they're the easy ones to resolve for us. So we might have, for example, a joint that's slightly loose, or sleepers that are not fully embedded within the track structure, and then we can just go out and do a spot intervention overnight. So we can actually get it down to the specific meter of track that's causing the impulsive noise within that property. Once we've carried out that repair, we'll then go back to the property and we'll take additional measurements to ensure that the noise has reduced as a consequence of that intervention, and then we'll have a discussion with the resident about whether we can close the complaint or not. Okay.
And TfL, you've previously committed £150 million each year to track improvements. Has the funding has the funding deal impacted this work?
My capital expenditure budget has reduced.
Okay.
And but it's layered for noise and vibration. So previously I used to run the maintenance division for track. Now I run all elements of track, and that happened last year. So I look after the end-to-end life cycle of track, so all capital work and maintenance. But within my maintenance budget, there was a specific provision for £2 million a year for spot interventions on the infrastructure. Because it's been a journey for noise for myself as well as the organisation. So because I now control all elements of track, I now determine which capital works we can undertake. So at the moment, we're undertaking work on sections where we have the most significant in-carriage noise, which is also a concern for our stakeholders. And what I can't do is take off the mitigations that I originally put in place that reduced the residential noise that's now created the in-carriage noise. So in those areas, we're now carrying out engineering work, and the area that is probably the longest section of noise is between Euston and Camden, and it's going to take about 18 months to complete that work. It's not a quick fix. We have to essentially smash up the infrastructure and then relay it night by night. So we do possibly 1 to 2 meters a night, and it's a very long section. So you're looking 500-600 shifts meter by meter until we complete that work. But we have committed to do that, and I do have the budget to undertake those works.
Okay, thank you. And how many rail-related noise hotspots have TfL identified in London, and what is the extent of the noise problem in these hotspots?
I have a list here. I actually didn't count the list. I had the specific areas.
Is it a long list?
So, well, there's I would say there's probably about 8 to 12, okay, just from a quick whip down the list. They all have their own specific nuances that is creating the noise within those areas, because they're in different lines, and because we have different rolling stock, different lines, we have separate issues.
Yeah. And what impact has there been from TfL's work to address noise and vibration across the tube network, both for residents and passengers?
I think I'd like to believe there's a recognition that we have significantly improved with regards to our complaints procedure and dealing with complaints. Unfortunately, there will be certain areas where we're unable to reduce the noise to a level that's wholly satisfactory to the residents. And some of that, there are factors at play here. So when you look at the Victoria line, there's no escaping that we changed the rolling stock, and we now run it as a much more intensive metro system. So you've got, I always go back straight to physics, it's kinetic energy that's being created. We are running 36 trains per hour service, so the trains are going quicker. So the V squared has significantly increased, and that's why the noise, the base level of noise will have increased within certain properties.
Right. And earlier we had Neil telling his experience with rail grinding and how that had led to improvements at
Yes.
times. I'm just wondering, so have you established a schedule of grinding at all locations with complaints about
We
noise?
do. We're actually carrying out a targeted intervention campaign at the moment on the Victoria line. And
Okay.
With regards to the Highbury and Islington, it's because our understanding's much better within all areas that we've now identified that I originally committed to carry out 2 grinding interventions a year on the Victoria line. And that was nothing more than just intuitive that every 6 months we'd possibly have to carry out an intervention, which we may have to do for some properties, but not all of them. It's a 2.7 kilometre section of track. And that takes about 3 months to complete for the grinding machines. And the one thing I always play back to people is really important for them to understand there are only 2 tube gauge grinding machines in the world that I can use. And I have a maximum of 240 shifts. It's an availability contract, so we have 240 shifts a year per machine. And those machines are actually, their primary use is for rail safety. So you get micro cracking on the top of rails. If you don't address that and grind it, then it will then propagate into deeper cracking. And if you don't replace the rails in time, you end up with an issue like Hatfield. So you have to make sure that your principal reason for grinding is to take the micro cracking off the rails. What I've carried out over a number of years of my team is becoming much more effective and efficient at our interventions, and that's freed up capacity to address noise complaints. And one of the areas we originally committed to was Highbury and Islington and King's Cross section, once every 6 months. But when we actually carry out the analysis, and this is the feedback from the residents themselves, that initially the noise on average was about 45 decibels per property that complained within that section of track, and it reduced to between 32 and 35 decibels. So the perceived volume had halved within the properties, so there was a noticeable difference. The feedback we were getting from the residents was when we were carrying out every 6 months, they didn't really notice a perceived difference, and that's because the corrugation hadn't grown as quickly as we originally assumed it would. So what we're proposing is, and we have carried out the full engineering analysis, is of the 2.7 kilometres, at least 1.9 kilometres of that doesn't benefit from an intervention every 6 months. It makes no difference we did it every 6 months. We believe it's roughly in the region of 12 months. There are certain properties, but the remaining 800 metres, where we believe that we might have to carry out additional interventions, and we will actively monitor those, and we have discussed that with the residents.
Yeah, it's interesting to see there's 2 machines in the whole world that can grind these rails, and
well, we need a machine that's it can fit into our smallest tube gauge.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, that's incredibly narrow.
Okay. And in getting back to complaint handling, how do you measure the extent to which your work adequately addresses the noise problem for residents?
Sorry, I missed that.
So in terms of complaint handling,
yes.
How does TfL measure the extent to which your work, so the remediation you're doing, addresses the noise problem for residents?
Well, we have I used to do this as part of my original role years ago in engineering, and recognising that as a wider stakeholder issue, that actually we probably hadn't been as active in this space as we should have been as an organisation. I've now appointed a full-time noise and vibration manager who works directly for me, and he has a team of people who he can draw upon their skills, which, as I've already said, is 5 acoustic engineers who can carry out the measurements. And we also have a full-time general engineer dealing with noise complaints and looking at the engineering, the science behind it, and a suite of other engineers who then carry out spot interventions dependent on what that one engineer decides he's going to do. But in answer to your question, we actually have a monthly steering group. So all of the stakeholders within the business who are associated with noise attend that. So I have engineering. Claude, who's my noise and vibration manager, chairs it. We have representation from the Chief Operating Officer's office. We have the legal team come to the meeting, the noise complaints team, and the acoustics team, engineering, and so on and so forth. Okay. And then we go through each complaint individually to see whether there is anything additional we should or could be doing.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Cooper.
Thank you. Hi, Duncan. Good to
Hi,
see you. Welcome back to the Environment Committee. I remember the meeting where we had a lot of the campaigners here with you some years ago, and obviously one of the areas where there's been significant issues in my constituency of Merton and Wandsworth is around South Wimbledon, which continues to be a problem. And I just wondered if we could get to the bottom of why the Pandrol Vanguards went in and now they appear to have been taken out. And although apparently you're saying that this means that despite that there's an 11 decibel reduction in the noise levels, I mean, considering the noise levels in some of the properties was being measured at 60 to 65 decibels, that still leaves it over the figure that we would expect people to, it shouldn't really be above 40 decibels, and even that is very high. What's going on, and how can rail grinding possibly help here when it didn't help before?
The Pandrol Vanguard is, I have to take responsibility. So when we brought in Night Tube, there was a concern at the time raised that the residents were going to experience significant disruptions to their sleep patterns through the introduction of a night service. And there are a number of sites that were identified as being of particular concern. And those sites, at the time, we didn't really understand the science as well as we should. But what I established from the marketplace was if we introduced a product called Pandrol Vanguard, which essentially suspended the rail on rubber blocks beneath those properties, it would address the peak noise that the residents were experiencing. So in most cases, it did reduce the volume by half, so 10 to 12 decibels. When we have improved, we've recognized that actually the root cause of the problem is the corrugation and the formation of it. And what I've introduced, unintended consequences, by suspending the rail and the corrugation, you can't grind the corrugated rail when it's on Pandrol Vanguard. And essentially, I've created a very large guitar string in the tube. So we now have a number of complaints from our passengers that there are certain sections of the infrastructure that are incredibly noisy. And so where we can, what we can't do now is I've created this issue that I can't just remove the Pandrol Vanguard because then the residential noise will go up by 10 to 12 decibels. What I have to do is look at controlling the root cause, which is the corrugation, and that will then ensure that not only do we reduce the internal noise, but we also reduce the noise in the properties back to the level that they would experience with Pandrol Vanguard on. So in short, what we've carried out in the specific section, and I do know the roads, which obviously I won't mention, is that we've re-railed under them, and we're monitoring very actively the corrugation within those sections, and where appropriate, we will grind them to ensure the rails are as smooth as possible. And I did see an acoustic engineer's report back last week, and the noise levels experienced in the properties are no worse, if not better, than those in the experience with Pandra Vanguard under them, now that we've re-railed. And what the challenge for us is to ensure that the noise then doesn't go up.
Is it possible to share the acoustic engineer's report with me so
yes,
that I can have a look and see what we're talking about? Because, you know, the residents are definitely saying, and we've just had a very eloquent email came at the beginning of this week, addressed not just to me but to, you know, most of the assembly, talking about the problems and issues in the local area.
Sure.
And obviously, you know, and it has got a lot worse. I don't know whether it's because of the automatic braking system, so the braking always takes place at exactly the same point, so the corrugation has got worse. I don't know whether it's because we activated the night tube from the summer of 2016 on the Northern Line, so people are now having trains run so much more frequently, so the buckling of the rails is, you know, proceeding apace. But, you know, the number of complaints has definitely gone up since the summer of 2016, and I actually took Heidi Alexander to visit some properties, and she was amazed when we were there with engineers from TfL, you know, because the lamp in the ground floor living room was literally swaying from side to side. And, you know, the frequency on the Northern Line is, it may not be 36 trains an hour as it is on the Victoria, but it's certainly very, very frequent. It's about once every 3 minutes, I would say, on average. And, you know, and if you're having to put up with this level of noise and also the vibration during the night as well, no wonder people are complaining. It's surely impossible for them to sleep or live. And it has got worse since 2016, and there doesn't seem to have been an effective way of dealing with it. And removing the PVs, but without having conducted the grinding, you know, seems to have brought the noise back up.
We replaced the rails. I mean, one of the things we're looking to do is to control the formation of the corrugation, and I don't want to get sort of engineering into it, but it's what we're looking to do is trying to control it through varying the speed of our rolling stock, which should again be another benefit for the residents, especially out of peak hours, where we're looking to slow the trains down to a specific velocity that actually starts to almost grind the corrugation off, so it self-regulates. And I am working with the engineering team to know what that impact would also be on the residents, because anything we can do to reduce the levels of noise experience in the properties, and I have visited the property that you were mentioning, and it was a sobering reminder of the impact it was having on people.
You know, it's absolutely awful. And of course, there's also the big curve from South Wimbledon where the train goes around a significant bend so that it can go down to the terminus at Morden. I mean, I would have thought reducing speed, certainly during the night when the trains are not running once every 3 minutes, must be possible. I mean, you know, people are still really struggling, I think, here. And I think, you know, whatever we can do, you know, I think Assembly Member Devonish is quite right that we want to see something so that we're not continuing to receive, you know, this is over 6 years now that some people have really been suffering. And I think perhaps people also then get very sensitised to noise, you know, and I think we have to understand that. But at the same time, suffering serious noise for 6 years or more than 6 years is something that I think is pretty insupportable. And people bought properties and it wasn't a problem for years and years and years, and now it is.
Well, fortunately, with regards to a number of the noise complaints, there has been an upgrade in the transmission-based train control system, the signalling system on the Northern Line, and it does allow us to do much more targeted interventions. Before, we had to put speeds in between station to station and had to stop the service, and it was almost insurmountable to do that. There were a couple of areas where we would put it on for the entire weekend. Otherwise, we had to stop the service and then take the speed on or off. One of those areas is West Finchley to Finchley Central, where we've actually got a targeted speed restriction on, and we will look at case-by-case basis where we can. What we have to do is then balance that against the fact of whether it then has a material disbenefit on our service, that we can't then run an effective service and gets very statico. So But certainly in this specific area that you're discussing, it's one that's very much on our radar about how we can improve it.
I mean, I think the whole of that section of the Northern Line from Kennington on downwards, and I know there's noise issues at Kennington, although that's not my constituency, because when the Northern Line extension went southbound, it's actually not very deep. I mean, you know, you can walk down the stairs, for example, at Balham, and there's not even that many stairs to get down to the line. So I think it is really important for people because it's, you know, the line is so close to the service. But I'll leave it there, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Assemblymember Cooper. If you could share that acoustic report as well with the whole committee,
yes,
that would be brilliant. Just want to welcome Charlotte to the chamber. Charlotte, we're discussing tube noise at the moment. You have a few minutes to settle yourself because we're going to finish this section and then barrage you with some questions. Assemblymember Best.
Thank you, Chair. I just would like to bring it back to bat for the Victoria line now. And one of the, I understand that the deep tube reconditioning of that particular stretch, the one Neil's mentioned earlier today, it would cost £29 million to undertake those works. Now, I've been pushing that, and I've always been told we're waiting for the long-term deal until I can get an answer on when that work will take place, which obviously now we have. So can you give us any more update of when that much needed work will happen for Neil and residents like Neil?
I mean, I certainly don't have £29 million freed up from capital to undertake a deep tube reconditioning in the Victoria line. I have to balance it. At the moment, I have a number of other higher priorities areas within the tube network. It's not to say that we are not going to undertake some form of reconditioning at some stage, but even on the Victoria line, the higher priority site at the moment is Pimlico to Victoria, where we are carrying out D-tube reconditioning. And when we look to complete that programme, then we'll look to see where we start extending it to. But again, I have to balance this against every metre of infrastructure that I control. So whether I'm trying to pick the right words without alienating myself from people, because it's a very important issue to them. But there are some people, for example, the complaint that Leonie is discussing, the levels experienced in that property are 4 times higher than other areas. So I have to almost prioritise those interventions as well. It's not an endless piss of money, and I have to make sure that the balance is to keep it within a reasonable spectrum of noise, because I can't eliminate the noise. There's a lot of properties that have been constructed very close to the tube network, and they will inevitably experience some noise. It's about keeping it as low as I can.
The problem is that it's, as Leonie mentioned, it's all this work from 2016. It wasn't this. That's where we're going back to. So, what people want is just what they had before. Essentially, you know, people understand there'll be some noise from the tube. It's and in that particular stretch, they've had 59 decibels registered, which I believe is one of the highest in London.
Yeah, that was a specific. That was actually a specific property, and I know exactly what the issue was there. There was an issue with the track for about 10 or 15 metres within the proximity of that property, which we've actually reconditioned. So the noise levels experienced at that property are nowhere near 59 decibels.
I think they're 47 at the moment. So it's still relatively very high. Yeah. So I think, and I say that £29 million figure to make sure that you understand that I understand how expensive that work is, and I completely understand where you're coming from. But what I don't understand is that with that long-term deal, people are looking for an answer, and so somewhere in that capital programme, be it over 10 years, be it over 15 years, people would like an answer of how that work will be carried out, when it will fit in, and if it's not all at one time, how those sections will be taken down. So I think it's not too much to ask that commitment, either be it over 5, 10, 15 years, a long-term strategy plan for deep tube reconditioning of that section of the Victoria line.
I mean, with that particular section, the reason I'm not being evasive about whether we're going to recondition it or not, I have to, as I said, I have to look at the specific priorities I have to contend with. We have identified, we believe, a new pad which will reduce the overall noise experienced by residents within that section, but we're still having to evaluate it at the moment, so I can't commit whether that's going to be the longer term solution. So as soon as we have been able to evaluate it, we will then communicated that with the residents, that we see that as the longer term solution, which is essentially jacking up the rails and putting some form of acoustic pad between the rail and the sleepers. The issue that's been experienced at the moment is a very hard surface between the rail, the base of the rail, and the sleepers.
When do you think that work will be ready?
Well, I need to establish first of all whether the pad doesn't make the track form too soft, because if it does, then unfortunately the trains could start to strike the side of the tunnel. There's an incredibly tight envelope within those tunnels.
I understand,
so we have to do it in a very controlled way.
Are we talking about in a year, 6 months, 3 months?
I hope to have it fully evaluated within the next 6 months.
Okay, so if this committee were to ask for an update on that specific report, within 6 months it would be ready?
Okay.
Yes?
Yes, we'll commit to letting
Thank
you know
you.
our progress on that.
And sorry, Neil, if I could come back to you. Is Neil still there?
Yes, thanks.
Hi, Neil. Thanks for joining us. I just wanted to come back to you and ask what, I think you did talk about this earlier, so really anything you wanted to add, but what are your experiences and residents within your group, what have their experiences been of engaging with TfL around tube noise?
Well, I think between 2000 and beginning of 2016 and Heidi's arrival and Duncan's arrival, I say arrival because I don't know how the structure works, but he appeared on the scene and replaced the previous representative of TfL. In that period, it was awful, absolutely awful. No answers to any questions, lots of reassurances, but no solutions. The solutions that were implemented just made things worse. That was the general noise and vibration issue. As to the individual problems, specific problems of track broken and things like that, which makes clanging noise and things, they're very good, always very good, always very good. Throughout the period that we have had any contact with TfL, we've always been very good on that, but consistently bad on everything else. Since Heidi and Duncan arrived, transformational. But as you said earlier, we would like to get back to the situation as it was in early 2016, and that has not been achieved. And Duncan has explained many of the reasons why that is, but it would be really nice to get back to that. I think the other thing is what we're seeing now is we're in a good place. We have grinding every 6 months. The bad news is, as has been discussed, it just gets worse in the next 6 months. Duncan is saying that he now has a lot more accurate, specific locational data, which means that he can target particular areas where the noise in the residential, in the homes, is the worst. We'll see. We're waiting to hear about that because, again, coming back to the data and information, particularly data, we don't have any. We have our own. We wander around with our apps and measure the increase in the noise level and things like that. But we don't have data which says, look, Neil, here's a map of Highbury and Islington to King's Cross. Here are the two lines, north and southbound. And these flags show you what our data is telling us. Now, you residents, you're living it. Tell us if what we're measuring on the tracks is actually what you're living in your homes. And that's the information. Maybe you don't want to engage to that level of detail with residents, but we have to trust one another here. We live in central London. We accept that there's going to be helicopters and ambulances and police cars and all that stuff. That's the price of living in London. But I think on that particular point, I would raise one other point, which is that in the Islington area, a lot of the housing, which is over the north and southbound line, is not private housing. It's social housing, it's housing associations, it's whatever one calls it these days. And at least one of our group has said, people are afraid to say, that person is not afraid to talk about the noise, but other people are afraid is perhaps too strong a word. But they're sort of concerned about their accommodation, and so there is a reluctance to talk about the noise and vibration problem. And I don't have any facts and figures on that for you, but it would appear to be something that's out there and needs to be taken into consideration.
Thanks, Duncan. I think that, sorry, thanks, Neil. I think there was a specific ask there, perhaps to take back to Duncan on a heat map almost across London of the tumult.
I don't know if as well, so we can provide that. I don't know why it hasn't been provided, to be honest.
Okay, that's good. And just before we move on, Neil, if you were today going to make any more asks, or if you wanted to hear anything else from TfL, is there anything else you'd specifically want to ask for or make a request?
No, obviously we hope that deep tube reconditioning is really, I mean, we're told that is a solution, so we're hoping for that one day when the finances and the priorities allow for it. This new pad sounds like a really good thing. What we need is reassurance that at the moment we have 6 monthly grinding committed to by TfL, and indeed a meeting every 6 months to talk about the situation, which is excellent. We're very, 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 very concerned of moving away from that, because we know it gives us relief. We know. Now, to exchange that for something else is a very big ask. So right now, Duncan is saying, trust me, I've got all the data. I can pinpoint the hotspots. I don't need to do the full north and southbound tracks every 6 months because it's a huge waste of resources, which I understand. I understand that argument and that position totally. But we're very concerned, if you take away what we've got now, where do we go? Do we end up in 6 months, a year's time coming back and saying, oh my God, this is a complete disaster. We've just gone back 2 or 3 years and we're into another fight, which we don't want. So help us here.
Thank you, Neil. And Duncan, just finally to you, I've spoken about in relation to the Victoria line. I think it's been picked up by others, but with this longer term deal now on the table for TfL, what longer term interventions across the TfL network will we now be seeing rolled out? Is there anything you wanted to add to that?
We do have a number of sites which will benefit from deep tube reconditioning, which is renewing the infrastructure and putting in much more sympathetic components with regards to the generation of noise. And that's an ongoing program, and I am committed to ensure that we do those interventions where wholly necessary. And again, I have to strike that balance. So I have, next year as an example, I have 15 areas where we have to carry out renewals of the infrastructure. Each of those sites will have noise factored into the design and the control of noise. So going forward, we will continuously improve as an organisation with our control of noise. With some areas, we're having to almost reverse engineer what's in there at the moment until we can actually renew those sections. So I can't commit to specific sites at the moment within these hotspots. I mean, there are probably certain sites here where I could come back and say, yes, we are actually going to be undertaking renewal work, and it will lead to a material change of the noise that's experienced by the properties at the end of that. But it's going to be a long process. What we are better able to understand now is how we generate corrugation, which is the root cause of most of the noise. And again, with the Victoria line, we are going to have to start looking at how do we control it through regulating the speed of our trains. So again, engineering have carried out a significant amount of analysis on that. We are going to start on the Northern line, and then we're going to look to see whether we can run that out onto the Victoria line, and that should almost self-regulate the corrugation. So for me, from a perspective of grinding, I'm not then just taking the residual life off the asset. So rail's incredibly expensive to replace, so I want to do everything I can to try and control the corrugation, which is the main cause of noise to the residents. So there are a number of different engineering interventions we're looking at. As I said, we're looking at the pads, the regulation of the speed. We're also looking at deep tube reconditioning where necessary and where appropriate with regards to funding and so on and so forth. So I think I'd like to believe that from a perspective of all of the residents, that we are much better as an organisation. We will continue to improve.
Sorry, just quickly check that on that work with more specific those specific sites and that specific work, is that going to be completed around the same time that you said that the Victoria Line strategy would be?
I've got one here for. I mean, my main focus at the moment is definitely the Euston Camden one. This is a significant intervention, but as I said, we've also got the Pimlico to Victoria is the next intervention that we're undertaking. But I can provide a list of the deep tube reconditioning sites to the committee, so you'll then know that at the end of those works, those areas will have better componentry, which will improve any noise experienced by residents in proximity to those properties.
Please, thank you, Duncan.
Thank you. Assemblymember McCartney.
Yeah, thank you. My question's for Duncan as well. Can I ask, I mean, I represent Enfield and Haringey, and my issues are particularly focused around the Seven Sisters area on the Victoria Line. And it's quite a highly mobile population. And residents that I was dealing with a few years ago when this came to the fore have either moved or they've given up. And I was just wondering, how do you measure your priorities? Do you look at it on the number of people have complained and say that there's issues? Because I've got a population in that area who, as I said, is highly mobile. They're very often low income, working, all hours. And residents, as you know, some speak louder than others. All have valid concerns. But I'm just checking that you're not just looking at the total number of complaints when you're looking at whether an area is a hotspot.
No, I do recognise that if I'm not careful, people can be very well organised in one area and might gain a material advantage over others if we were just chasing the politics. So it is on a case-by-case basis. So as soon as someone brings it to our attention that they are experiencing noise within their property, then we will go in. Now, you are correct that we are then aware, and we do try and then map other properties within proximity of that noise complaint. So we have one where there's a specific noise complaint, and Emma mentioned one of 59 decibels. We are very aware then there will be other properties within a certain sort of radius of that property who will inevitably be experiencing noise complaints. In some of those areas, we will then go and speak to the residents and ask whether they'll allow us to take measurements. Some people are reluctant, for perhaps they think that it's going to be something they would then have to declare, and it will then reduce the value of their property, or they'll be seen as a troublemaker. And there's many, many reasons why people don't want to engage with us. But as soon as we do get a complaint, we will then look at it and we will look to put an intervention, and hopefully the other people around that property will then experience the benefits as well. But with regards to Neil's concern, we are understanding the science better from our own train-borne monitoring equipment, and then we're mapping those too. So we have something called an automatic track monitoring system on our rolling stock on the Victoria Line, and that's how we can understand the depth of corrugation much better on the track. So, and then we're overlaying the residential complaints, so we can recognise in certain areas when you have this level of corrugation, you get that level of noise experience within the properties. And that's what's driving our grinding interventions. Say, actually, there's a lot of properties here where the corrugation hasn't changed since the last time we ground, where there are other properties where it has increased. And with regards to Seven Sisters, we're looking to extend that out now, so we can then almost second guess areas where we think, well, there might not be many complaints, but there's inevitably going to be a lot of noise generated because the track's in this condition. And that's where we're then targeting our grinding. So we're trying to be slightly more proactive in that.
Okay, that's reassuring. And I was going to ask, and you sort of answered it there, about apart from just receiving complaints, how do you engage with residents when you're aware there is an issue in an area?
We do engage with residents on letter drops where we're going to carry out specific interventions on the infrastructure. So we do that as part of our Section 61 compliance to gain consent. and then we'll do a letter drop to then notify people that we're going to carry out work that will inevitably impact them from a noise perspective. The one that I could probably best articulate with regards to work that I'm doing for noise is, in order for us to change the infrastructure, sometimes we have to take a backward step. So when we change from Pandrel Vanguard, I have to take the Pandrel Vanguard off for 90 metres so we can jack the track up, take off the Pandrel Vanguard, and then start changing the track underneath it, because you need that transition. We know that the residents will then experience 10 to 12 decibels of noise increase within their properties, so we will then notify them to say, you know, we are incredibly sorry, we're having to do this work. For the next 6 to 8 weeks, you will experience an increase in noise, but then it will reduce to the level it was before and hopefully improve on that.
Okay. And can I also ask, do you do anything proactive about letting Londoners know that you have a complaints email or whatever? And the reason I ask is that I had a long-standing issue in Tynemouth Road in Tottenham with your ventilation shaft for the Victoria line, which gets cleaned every 6 months, but towards the end of that 6 months, residents, particularly at night, have real issues with the noise coming from that. But they weren't aware they could actually contact you directly.
I did check, because on my notes here, I was assured that the complaints procedure was easier to follow. And I just quickly Googled, I'm sure there's other providers, that tube noise complaints, and it instantly came up with a telephone number. And there is a specific line now. And there's also online that if you do type it in, there's a link that you can just type a direct complaint. And we have a team who specifically focus on tube noise complaints. I don't know how much more we can. I suppose we could probably advertise it, but it's. But if
no, I just want a bit more prominent, because residents said they had looked, and because it's got a ventilation shaft, I'm not sure whether they would classify it as a tube.
I tried a couple of.
Could I just chip in?
Yes.
Could I just chip in on the complaint very, very, very briefly? Because I've been complaining about the complaints section on the website, the TfL website, for 6 years now. What it says is, when you go on it and you want to enter your noise and vibration complaint, it says, what's your problem? And you say, noise and vibration. And then lower down it says, when did you travel? Right. Now, I didn't travel. I'm sitting in my home. So the question, the first question, which is, what's the type of complaint? And there's a list, and it says noise and vibration. That's fine. Then lower down it says, when did you travel? Instead of saying, first of all, are you a staff member? Are you someone who's travelling? Or are you a resident? And then you click on that, and then you enter your complaint. And I think that would help everybody, the people trying to complain and TfL, because then the data collection would be instant and immediate and categorised very clearly and simply. And I've been asking that for, as I say, 6 years. And I think there's been a slight change. But that categorisation would be so helpful to the individuals and to TfL to actually put that in. Just like you have a menu for, is it noise vibration, is it this, is it that, and you click on that one. Then lower down it just say, are you a staff member, are you a user, a traveller, or are you a resident or other? And you click on that one, and then you enter your complaint, and all of a sudden the categorisation is done, the data collection is facilitated. I'll stop there.
That's an idea, Duncan.
That's a sensible suggestion, yes. I didn't look beyond the headlines, unfortunately, so I will bring that up at the next steering group. Thank
you, that'd be really helpful. Can I also ask, and say I've been an Assembly member for many years now, I think I'm probably the longest in the tooth here, and until 15, 16, we didn't really get any complaints about tube noise. There were the occasional ones, but nothing like the deluge we seem to have had since then. And I know TfL has given various explanations. For example, on the Victoria line, it might have been the advent of the new trains and track. In central London, it's been cellars that amplify the sound waves. But is there anything that TfL can point to as to why across London, in that space of a couple of years, there seems to be a different view from residents as to the level of noise they've been getting?
I mean, I wouldn't know the why people specifically are complaining. All I can say is that the ability to complain has improved. So, and also our reaction to those complaints has significantly improved. And there are a number of people, when I first started looking into noise and vibration, there was no process, end-to-end process in TfL. You were very lucky if you found someone who actually knew what the solution was to your problem. And that's why I put in an end-to-end process involving engineering and evaluation and feedback loops and customer complaints system and so on. And by doing that, I would like to believe that the confidence in the system has improved to a point where people believe that if they do make a complaint, we will take action. And that's just from, as I said, just some feedback I've had. I mean, inevitably in some areas there has been a slight increase in noise experienced, and it's not because our infrastructure is in any worse condition. If anything, the track quality that we measure now is in the best track quality that we on record. We are running a more intensive metro system than we were a decade ago.
And that leads me on to my next. It's picking up something that Emma said a little earlier. Now you've got your funding deal from government, and hopefully, once this is finished, there'll be some more capital funding. So I've been pushing for the upgrade of the Piccadilly line as of TfL. We know that we've got new trains arriving in 2025. We don't yet have funding for the track and signalling. But obviously, there's now the fear that if we get the new trains running on the old track, am I likely to get a deluge of complaints from residents that live near the Piccadilly line? I suppose my question really is, what is TfL doing to ensure that all their infrastructure investment from now on does utilise the best possible sound mitigation? You did touch on it a little earlier.
Yes, I work very closely with the engineering team, so it is part of our design process now.
Okay.
So the componentry and is specifically chosen for suppression of noise.
Okay, thank you. And then my final question then is around your own construction sites. Yeah. Do you have a policy about noise mitigation? And if so, can you send it to us?
Yes,
or what are the top lines about what you try to do, particularly with regards, I think, to residents and inconvenience to residents?
Yes, I can provide that to you. I mean, I have a team of people who, before we undertake targeted interventions, which are inevitably on the weekends, we then apply to the councils and for Section 61 and for consent.
Okay, fine. And sorry, I'd say it was my final question, but it wasn't. You're doing works, and this is I'm using the example as a generic, but you're doing works to Cockfosters.
Yes.
I think there's a new maintenance shed being built. And in preparation of that, you've cut down a lot of vegetation. Residents are absolutely appalled. They can now see the tracks and the what is essentially a building site and railway sidings. But it's the noise in particular they can now see. Can you just give me an assurance that in all those cases where it's possible, you will replant?
Yes.
And is that part of your design process?
We do. We only carry out work that's wholly necessary to facilitate. So I'm actually just dealing with a specific complaint at the moment, actually at South Harrow, where we had to remove a number of trees to facilitate the installation of the new sidings. And so I don't actually manage the. It sounds very sort of internal TfL. It's the Piccadilly Line upgrade programme are managing the works in Cockfosters, but it's actually being delivered predominantly by my team. So I can provide you any information that you seek on that.
Yeah, okay, thanks. We have contacted
TfL
about it, so hopefully the query has come to you anyway. Yeah. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Assemblymember McCartney. In a moment, I'm going to go to Assemblymember Cooper, and then we're going to bring in Professor Clark as well before we take a short 15-minute adjournment, or maybe 5-minute adjournment. We'll see how we're doing with time. Can I also extend a special welcome to Year 4 from New City Primary School in Newham. Hello, Year 4. You're very welcome. We are the Environment Committee, and at the moment we're talking about how noisy the underground, the tubes are, and what that might do for our health and our ears and our everything. Assemblymember Cooper.
Thank you. It was actually just about, which you've referred to, and Assemblymember McCartney was just talking about keeping track of noise because people move in and out. But the other obvious area, apart from us having residents contacting us, is about the noise inside the carriages.
Yes.
And the number of complaints that I've received from people who live in my constituency but use the tube, who then say, my goodness, the Victoria line between Pimlico and Victoria, or for all of us who are now travelling over here, I could mention at least 3 or 4 different places along the Jubilee line where actually when I'm sitting in the carriage I quite frequently see people literally sticking their fingers in their ears. And I did see a BBC reporter, I think it was, who had taken a decibel monitor onto the tube and was showing that it said 120 decibels, which is about twice as loud as it's been in people's houses. Now, I mean, obviously it's very difficult because obviously you'll only be passing through that level of noise for a very brief period. But it also seems to have got much, much louder inside the carriages. Is that linked to the upgrades of the trains, the corrugation of the tracks, the automated braking system and the night tube running, or is there something else going on? Because I don't remember it being this noisy before the last few years.
I referred to it earlier. I created a bit of a monster with regards to the Pandrel Vanguard. So there was 37 sections where we originally installed that for residential complaints, and then that increased the noise that's been experienced in the rolling stock. And we are section by section now removing them. So one of the sections that you referred to was South Wimbledon, coming from Walden through South Wimbledon. It was terrible. And so that's the reason that we've re-railed that section and taken the Pandrel Vanguard out and looking to keep the rails as smooth as possible. So we're striking that balance between the residential complaints and the in-carriage noise that's experienced. And that's the same with Euston to Camden. That was my longest section. I think it was 720 metres of PV. So it lasted for about 3 minutes, which was not a good experience for our customers. So in answer to your question, yes, we do monitor it. I mean, the biggest single concern that we have was actually for our colleagues who use the infrastructure and drive the rolling stock. So the time-weighted average is something that we actively monitor to ensure that we are not breaching the health and safety regulations. And from memory, I think it's 80 decibels end-to-end on a time-weighted average, shift-to-shift for our drivers. So I'm going through those section to remove the Pandrel Vanguard. The other specific issue, and actually the section with the most significant decibel levels, is the Jubilee Line extension. And that's actually the inherent design of the Jubilee Line extension. And we're now looking to install known as stick lubes, so we're going to self-lubricate the wheels on the rolling stocks, and that again is something we're bringing in very shortly. So the rolling stock is actually the wheel rail interface, so that's what you can hear is the squealing as you're going around, and we're looking to lubricate that, and that should then significantly reduce the decibel levels. But as with any change, we have to do it in a very controlled way, because what we don't want is a rolling stock to shoot through the stations because they're too lubricated, and that's
that was my follow-on question: is if we're lubricating the wheels, then would that not affect the braking performance of the train? And I was going to mention although it's very short for us as passengers, the impact on drivers, but you're obviously monitoring that.
Yes.
So presumably the lubrication would come in to try and do something about the squealing,
yes,
but would then go away. I don't know how that would happen.
It will reduce it. It's very tilted. Also, we're to talk about canting curvature. So the track on the Jubilee line, it has you're constantly fighting centrifugal force, where you're trying to take the rolling stock around at the speed, and the wheels are naturally just digging into the rails, and that's one of the issues with the Jubilee line extension. It was I believe, and I realise I'm in a public forum, so I should be much more cautious about my facts. But the padding under the Jubilee Line extension was installed to try and reduce noise in the residential areas, but it then softens the track form, which then causes the squeal.
So sorry. So I mean, it's this kinetic energy, isn't it, that we've talked about before? That either it's going into the residential areas or into the carriages. So is it possible to reduce, and is it really at 120 decibels? I mean, I found that astonishing to see somebody with a decibel monitor. do you know what level you're going to be able to reduce it down to with all the different interventions that you're talking about, and specifically the new lubrication of the wheels?
I mean, with regards to the JLE, no, I don't know which level it's going to reduce by, but anything would be an improvement.
You have an acoustic report on the Jubilee and the Victoria for what we're suffering now and what it's likely to go to?
We have an acoustic report of what the levels are now. With regards to what we will experience after we've managed to get the stick lube back on the rolling stock, I can't commit to that.
Would you be able to share the current report on where we are now so that we can see whether it really is up to 120? Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Charlotte, we're now going to turn to you to talk about tube noise, and then we're going to return to road traffic noise. For the young people, Professor Clark here is a scientist from a university, so we're going to ask her how this affects our health, I believe. Assembly Member Devenish.
Thank you, Chair. Just one final comment for Duncan, if I could. When we have our meeting after the mayoral question, I'd like to see that you're actually showing a step change in the amount of work we're doing on tube noise, because what hasn't been said a lot, but actually was admitted at the last Transport Committee meeting, TfL were very happy with the settlement they now have financially. So the days when we could talk about no money for TfL are long gone. You've got a very generous settlement. I know the Mayor, for various reasons, doesn't want to thank the government for the generous settlement, but it was a generous settlement. So I'm hoping there'll be more work on tube noise for all of us across London, because this is not a political point. This is about public health. And that brings me on very nicely to Professor Clark. Welcome, Charlotte. Thank you very much for coming this morning. So in your opinion, please, what impact is tube noise pollution having, and particularly in terms of public health for Londoners?
Thank you. So all environmental noise is known to have an effect on public health, and the sorts of effects it has can be a lot more serious than people think. So it tends to start with complaints, and health-wise that relates to what we call annoyance. People will be annoyed, they get stressed. Because this exposure goes on over time, you're chronically stressed. That in your body means that your heart rate goes up, you get high blood pressure, you get all the risk factors for cardiovascular disease. And so over a long course of exposure of several years, it can lead to things like heart attacks, strokes, and ultimately it does have a small effect on mortality, and it can lead to premature death. But that's over a very long period of exposure you would get those effects. It also has an effect on mental health. People have to live with this stressor and they can't control it, and so that it also has a detriment on their health. And there's also sleep effects. So if you have exposure at night time, it causes you to wake up, limits how much sleep you're getting. You're supposed to get 7 to 8 hours sleep a night. And interestingly, those sleep effects also cause all those cardiovascular effects as well. So that's one of the ways that it can also have those effects on health.
Thank you. And what about two very vulnerable groups in the community, which I've had people come to me, one pregnant and new mothers with babies, but also elderly people who are at the end of their life that can't actually get out and about. So they are stuck in their home 24/7, and this noise is really giving them problems. How about those two specific groups, please?
Yes, so the elderly are thought to be a vulnerable group for the reasons you point out, that they spend more time in their residence. They've also got most likely to have pre-existing ill health, so that also makes them vulnerable, and that's true of other age groups. We think that if you're already unwell, that you might react more to noise, or you're less able to cope with it as a stressor. In terms of pregnant women, pregnant people, less evidence on that, in all honesty. There's been lots of work of occupational noise and its effect on pregnancies and birth outcomes, but not so much have we looked at that as a vulnerable group. That's not to say they're not a vulnerable group, but we don't have evidence for that.
And are you able to write to the committee with any more information that we could pass on to Seb Dance as the Deputy Mayor for Transport and the Mayor himself, just to make sure that Duncan gets as much resource as he can to really get on top of this problem. And I think public health, I was the first cabinet member of public health in Westminster when it came over from the NHS a decade ago. I think this is an under-reported public health issue compared to all the other important public health issues, and any pressure you can bring to bear will be much appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, of course we can pass some information across.
Thank you, and very much appreciate that information. Moving to road traffic noise, it's really the same question now. So you just detailed a lot of the kind of mental health impacts and effects. Are there any specific to road traffic noise and other major sources?
The effects I describe are really relevant for road traffic, railway noise, and also for aircraft noise. They tend to be the three sort of environmental sources that we look at. Road traffic is quite interesting in planning. It's dealt with a little bit differently and measured over a different time period. But I think for all of the noise sources you're interested in, you know, the WHO have set guidelines for exposures, and so those guidelines cover 24-hour metrics, so how much a level for the day, evening and night, and they also set a separate night. And so for road traffic, that's 53 over the 24 hours, and it's I think it's 44 or 45 for the night time period.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over now to Assembly Member Best, who I believe has a question for you.
Thanks very much, and good morning, Charlotte. According to the Mayor's Environment Strategy, road traffic is the largest single cause of noise pollution in London and is likely to affect the most people. But a paper looking at noise complaints at a London-wide level found that in 2019 and 2020, neighbourhood noise and construction were the top noise complaint categories. Can you comment on the impact of noise from construction and neighbours?
Sure. So yeah, you're right. Road traffic is the most common exposure for all of us, and we tend to overlook it, I think, because it's so common. Construction noise is a big problem. It's been less researched scientifically, and in some ways it's actually got stronger controls than most of the other environmental sources, because when there's planning consent, there are certain levels are set for different times of the day and different days of the week to cover that, and it's monitored. Often it is monitored, whereas most noise sources are that you don't monitor at all. And so construction noise can have those same health effects that I mentioned earlier, and lots of schemes will, if you have exposure over many days above the levels that are set for construction, they will move people out, put them in a hotel, or take some sort of do something like that so that people can avoid that exposure. But you're in a system now where planning's often going on for a very long time, so construction noise tends to be viewed as short term, but actually if you think about that exposure over several years for people, it's up there with the other noise sources that we're talking about in terms of its potential to impact health.
Thank you. And did you have anything to add on the neighbours and
neighbour noise is a huge problem, and it's very much under-researched because it's a very difficult noise source to research, because housing stock varies so widely. It's really difficult to do it, but that's not to say that we shouldn't try and build more knowledge on it. Obviously, we know people complain, we know it's an issue, but in terms of the health effects, it could have those same health effects, but it would be very hard for me to bring you evidence to back those assumptions up at this point because of the lack of research.
Thanks. Do you want to say something specifically on that? All right, go on. Thanks. I just wanted to bring up the data in the environment strategy is from 2011. So is there any way to provide a more up-to-date overview of what current noise pollution levels are in London?
Yes, you'd be able to get that from the data DEFRA provide for the Environmental Noise Directive. So I can send you the link for that. So noise gets mapped across England for towns that have more than 200,000 population, and that's done for London. And that also feeds into burden of disease calculations, so you should be able to get some information that will be helpful for London from that.
Thank you. And one final question that I'm surprised our chair hasn't asked, but maybe he's trying to be impartial today. But have you thought or looked into what the road pollution noise may be from the new Silvertown tunnel?
Not specifically, but it will have been the environmental assessment for the tunnel will have had to have a noise chapter, and that will have noise modelling in that will give you what it is baseline and what it's modelled, what it's predicted to be for the tunnel for the changes.
Do you think that a new tunnel and that new road will increase road traffic noise?
I don't know enough about the scheme to be able to comment. Sorry.
Thank you, Assembly Member Best, and I'm glad you've noted I've managed to contain myself. I'd love to chat to you about the scheme, though, outside of the committee another time. As Chair, I have to remain impartial. Assembly Member Bakari to finish us off.
Okay, I was worried about some feedback, considering the topic was... I'm just going to talk a little bit about the construction and the other noise complaints that you were talking about. You said that there hasn't been enough research on neighbourhood noise as well, and I come from a kind of a different perspective than some of the members here have been talking about tube noise, etc. But in my particular constituency, where I'm councillor, the biggest complaint I have is dogs, which is, I'm sorry to say to dog lovers, but it's actually one of the biggest complaints that I'm getting. I'd like to know whether you find that as coming up within your research. And as well as that, the construction of housing tends to allow noises to go through buildings a lot more. So people walking around their own houses and just living, that seems to be increasing as well. I mean, I understand that there is very limited research, but is that something that you're picking up? And additionally, do you think that also the pressure is that the councils don't have enough resources and people really to do the enforcement? That you say there is laws there in place to alleviate and tackle these issues, but they're just not able to tackle that because of the fact that we don't have enough enforcement officers in our councils at the moment.
So dog noise is the most complained about noise internationally. Across from studies in Australia show it, studies here, our national noise surveys, it's always the most complained about noise source. So that it does surprise people, but you're finding it is a problem. It's a very common problem. Neighbour noise. So building regulations are supposed to avoid the issues you talk about where you can hear footsteps, but so that you don't get that ingress of people's noise coming into your own home. But the issue is that building stock is so complicated, because over years the building regulations have improved to address these noise issues within people's homes. But that's a slow solution, because you're only building a certain amount of new housing stock. You've got all your old houses that were built under different regulations. You convert houses into flats. That's one of the biggest causes of those sorts of issues as well, where noise comes through. And it's a really big issue, and it's acknowledged, but that's put forward as the solution, is the building regulations and the standards being enforced. But that's a slow solution for what the problem is. And it's quite expensive problems to fix. And sometimes, particularly in conversions, you may not be able to fix it just because of what you've actually got in the house. There may not be an easy solution between the floors and the ceilings to actually do the insulation that you might want.
Just quickly, do you think it is an issue with the enforcement officers, just not that element of resourcing?
I think particularly perhaps for the construction noise, because that's probably the most controlled source. So I think that is one area perhaps. I think often there's lots of monitoring, but actually is anybody looking at the data, or what happens if the data shows that the levels are higher than they've been predicted? So I think it would be helpful, yes.
Thank you. We're going to take a short break now before we move to aviation. It's 11:35, so I propose 11:40. Charlotte, I know you're staying with us, but thank you very much, Duncan, for all your answers this morning. And thank you to Neil, who's still with us online, I believe. Thank you for all your campaigning, and we very much appreciate it. We'll see you all in 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Welcome back to the second session of the Environment Committee following our short adjournment, and welcome to our panel of guests on the topic of aviation noise. We are rejoined in the chamber by Charlotte Clark, Professor of Epidemiology, Population Health Research Institute, St George's University. I would also like to welcome Shamal Ratnayaka, Aviation Strategy Lead at TfL, Paul Beckford, Coordinator of Heathrow Association for the Control of Aircraft Noise, HACAN, and Bridget Bell, Campaigner Plain Hell Action. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to begin by handing over to Assembly Member Bakhari.
Thank you, Chair. Charlotte, we're going to go back to you, and I think you may find that some of the answers that you said before may be similar, but what is the impact in noise pollution from aircraft and helicopters having on the health of Londoners, and how does this compare with London's exposure to noise from other sources?
Sorry, can I just get you?
Sorry.
Thank you.
Aircraft noise has various effects on public health. So it causes annoyance that leads to stress responses. Over time, chronic exposure, you get those biological responses that increase your risk factors for cardiovascular, metabolic disorders. And so over time, very long time, you get those harder health endpoints for heart attacks, strokes, and ultimately premature death. It also has effects on mental health and well-being because you're living with a chronic stressor. And for aircraft noise, we've also got good evidence that it has an effect on children's learning. So if you attend a school that's exposed to certain levels of aircraft noise, you would perform less well in your cognitive development. In terms of in the UK, we've got about 1 million people at least who are exposed to levels that we think are harmful. Quite a lot. I think Paul would probably agree if those are London-based just because of the number of airports and how airspace is organised across a large population within London. So for London, it is a major source of environmental noise pollution.
Thank you. That's quite shocking about the learning that it impacts as well for children. Paul and Bridget, I would really need to hear from your voices. It's so important in this. Can you describe some of the Londoners' experiences of aviation noise? Shall we start with Paul and then Bridget?
Sure, thank you very much. There's a range of experiences, but we've got, as HACAN, we've got members across the city. So this isn't just something that's close to the airport or at the end of a runway. This is noise from very early in the morning, as Bridget knows all too well, to late at night. So these are aircraft that are disturbing you in the day. They're disturbing your sleep and they're waking people up. And I think that's where the real health problems really start to occur in terms of the evidence that supports that. But it's an intrusion. Once you are disturbed by the noise, it's not like you can either just go back to sleep or suddenly ignore it. It's constant. And therefore it becomes not only a physical health issue, but a mental health one as well. So we've got members that, we've existed since the 70s. So obviously the planes were a lot noisier then, but we've now got double the number of aircraft. So although, individual aircraft may be getting slightly less noisy, the cumulative impact is just as great. And I'm sure we'll get onto it later on, but there's a whole range of issues around the sort of airspace modernisation piece where we're going to see changes to flight paths. That's going to mean more noise and new noise for new areas. And there's a lot of uncertainty around that, which is causing our members a lot of concern at the moment.
Oh, sorry. I was under a flight path for 4 years and I had to move. Having bought my house 30 years previously, in 2016, the noise just suddenly occurred over me. And I wasn't alone because I began a petition which I took to our local community council, and we got about 800 signatures in the first 18 months. And then there was an online petition which has got about 1,500 signatures, some of which may be replicated by the people who've signed the paper one. And we were picking up complaints from those affected by Heathrow and those affected by City, because the part of London that Plain Hell Action South East... I'm
really sorry to interrupt you, Bridget. Is it okay to bring the mic closer or to bring yourself close to the mic? Yeah. We're just struggling to hear.
Is that better?
Much better, thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
The patch of London that I was particularly covering has flight paths crossing each other, arriving to both City and to Heathrow. And there are 2 or 3 sways going through Lewisham and Southwark. And a fellow campaigner was right under the City and Heathrow flight paths, double-crossing her over the day, and I can read out sections of what people have written to me as part of the person monitoring, one of the people monitoring the website. It'll take me a little moment to find, but perhaps if I can begin with how it's affected me. On several occasions when I've responded to a consultation, I feel sick with lack of sleep and my balance is shaky for the same reason. I have a headache, my vision is unstable. This is due to being woken at 4:30 a.m. by so-called super heavy and heavy planes 2 days in a row after 4 days flight-free due to change in wind direction. I am expected by my employers to work today as I expect and am expected to 4 days each week. On another occasion, I wrote, I have near permanent mouth ulcers. My heart rate increases with the sudden shock of being woken out of the body's natural cycle. It takes several hours to gain any sort of mental and physical equilibrium. Not good for someone still working 4 full days a week, and certainly not good in terms of longer-term health impacts. And I would, having lived in the house for 30 years in Southwark, and suddenly finding in 2016 overnight that there were planes coming over my house from 4:30 in the morning until 11 or 11:30 at night without break. And just to give an idea of a piece that I wrote for our website, on the 13th of March, Tuesday the 13th of March 2018, the first plane came in at 4:27 a.m. at 67 decibels. For the next half hour, there are another approximately 10 planes, and they are all over 61 decibels. This is a night flight. It's not even the shoulder period. And we're not supposed to have, as Dr. Clark will say, anything more than 45 over the night. And these are individual events. We're not interested in the averaging. We don't want to know what happens over 18 hours and so many decibels, and over the night and so many decibels. I know, having been woken at 4:27, I don't go back to sleep. And when you get that sort of level of sleep deprivation, not just for 2 mornings in a row, there was a time when it was 3 weeks, 4 weeks in a row. And the only blissful moment about the first lockdown was when the winds were in the east, and we had 6 weeks of no planes at all, so much so that I thought that the planes had stopped because they were supposed to be stopping, and then the wind changed and we got the planes back again at 4:30, not necessarily passenger planes, because I was checking on the arrivals website for Heathrow to see where these planes were coming from, and they were freight coming in at 4:30. And why couldn't freight come in during the day? The other thing about being in lockdown was that, of course, I was in my house the whole time. So planes did carry on during the day. Now, that's something to do with COVID and being in lockdown and being sort of incarcerated in one's own home. But I rather loved my house. I'd spent 30 years building it up into something that I quite like being in, and a not particularly beautiful part of London, but, you know, it was my haven. And I began to really dread going home at the end of a working day. And I could tell that there were planes because you can feel them. I mean, you just feel them. And then I could see them circling over Westminster Bridge, and I thought, fiddlesticks. Actually, I didn't think fiddlesticks. You can imagine what I was thinking. I'm going to go home. It's 7 o'clock, and this noise is going to carry on until 11 or 11:30. If it's in the summer, I can't sit outside. If I want to, as I did once, take my cordless phone out into the garden to speak to somebody who didn't know where I lived, and the person said, "Are you near an airport?" And I said, "No, I'm 20 miles away from Heathrow." "God," she said. So that's the noise level. I asked my parents, did I always used to complain like this? And they said no. Because Heathrow told me, and probably if I'd been complaining to City, Heathrow told me that nothing had changed. But in fact, the way the planes are flying had changed. And if only Heathrow could have been honest and explained what had happened, because there may well have been a flight path over my house for the last X number of years, 50 years, however many years planes have been flying. But I wasn't told that they were now concentrating down the central 3-kilometre wide swathe that you've got, coming down the middle, which was over my house and over other people's houses going into Battersea. I've had comments sent to me saying we've moved our bedroom from the top floor to the second floor because we can't sleep. I could talk about the London City comments. My fellow campaigner, Mo Corder, who is an IT expert and can understand noise in a way that I don't, was having to cope with 80 decibels with flights to Heathrow coming in at just under 4,000 feet and then being undercrossed by City at just under 2,000 feet at the same time. And she's moved from London because the Northern Line was operating not just whatever it was, 12 hours a day, but 24 hours a day. And she couldn't hack the noise day and night from above and below. And the trouble is with people who are doing modelling and who are planning and so on, is by and large, they're not actually experiencing what's going to happen. And modelling is just a model. It's not actually what's going to happen necessarily when you put the whole plan into action. So it's policy decisions that are made on modelling have got to be taken with a great deal of caution and perhaps have a lot of mitigation built in, which we don't get. I'll stop in a second, but I get a bit revved up about this because I was driven out of my house. I couldn't hack it anymore, and I thought, I want to carry on living. I've got parents, I've got family, I've got friends. All the things I liked in London I don't experience anymore because I'm not here. But it wasn't much fun anyway because I was always going to come back to noise. And the only place that was quiet in my house was a little galley kitchen which had brick walls around it. And I could spend 3 hours boiling an egg just to get out of the noise. It's an existence, it's not a life.
Thank you so much, Bridget. Your voice is very, very important. So please, I don't want you to refrain yourself because you do need to speak about this issue. And Paul, maybe you could help me with this question. Have you noticed, or have you got any evidence that it's not just mental health and health generally that's been impacted, but also the financial situation for some of the people that have been having to deal with this noise as well? Has it impacted their jobs?
There's certainly some evidence to show, obviously, sleep deprivation impacts people's productivity. So there's stuff out in academic evidence that helps support that. And of course, if you poor sleep, you may end up losing your job. So there's probably some anecdotal evidence that supports that, where people have had to lose their jobs or can no longer commute in the same way because of the operation. The impact as well that's financial is some people suffer from sort of a lock-in syndrome because they cannot afford to move from where they are for a variety of reasons. And this is particularly impacts people with poor mental health. If they're highly vulnerable already and they can't get out, and the aircraft noise may be a trigger for their specific condition, this is exacerbated because they can't move, they can't go anywhere. So there's a feeling of entrapment, which makes their condition worse. So again, there's a cost to that, to them, but also to the health service as well. And I'm pretty sure we don't really accurately capture that in the way we do the appraisal of these systems at the moment.
Thank you, Assembly Member Devenish.
Thank you, Chairman. I should declare an interest because my family moved to Ashford, Middlesex in 1899, and some of the land under Terminal 1 was nicked off us during the war. We were promised it back and we never got it back, and my late mother died this year, but she lived in Ashford, Middlesex right until the end, and I had many members of my family living there until last year, and they've all now moved, and one of the main reasons, you guessed, it's Heathrow Airport. And I have to say, out of all the public bodies and semi-public bodies I work with as an elected politician, Heathrow wins the award every time as the most unresponsive body. They should be a special award for them every year for being the most unresponsive body, in my view. So I am slightly biased, Chair, I will admit that. Before I ask my specific questions, the thing I'm really struggling with at the moment, and I've got a number of people looking at this at the moment. We all know there was a whole load of consultations coming out at Heathrow before COVID to do with the runway and all the other things. But they seem to have changed their tactics, but they're being quite opaque on what's happening. If anybody's got any comment particularly on what they're doing in so-called double stacking of aircraft over London and how this is actually going to occur and how it's going to damage air quality further. We're hearing lots of at the moment kind of anecdotal whispers, but I have not managed, and I've been campaigning on this for many years with others, managed to get any real clarity in terms of what is happening, either from Heathrow themselves or from other people following this. So particularly maybe Paul, if you have any comments on the double stacking, because I think that's going to do huge damage to both air quality and noise. And then I'll ask Chair my specific questions.
I have to have a go, and I'm shocked, Council Member Devonish, to learn that Heathrow are being opaque and slightly awkward with you. It's a revelation to me and to many of our members. I think what you're referring to is what's being done around the consultations on airspace modernisation. Heathrow had proceeded with the process that's governed by the CAA associated with the third runway. Obviously, that's now certainly put on hold officially, if not completely unaffordable for them, I would have thought, given they've lost £4.5 billion since the start of the pandemic, and their major shareholders looking to sell up. The airspace, so they've had to pause that airspace plan that's associated with the third runway, and they had to restart a new plan for just the 2-runway hub. So all of that, the consultation you saw back in 2019, that's all been put to one side, and they've started from scratch. And the double stacking, I think, is referring to the potential of what the introduction of greater concentrated flight paths. So this is sort of the experience that Bridget was referring to currently, and that's already happening to a certain degree because the new satellite technology is coming into the airspace system. But the modernisation is going to redesign the entirety of the airspace over London and the South East. This will mean new flight paths and potentially noise for communities who currently don't experience it. It's also going to see a deterioration of the noise environment for communities currently under flight paths. So if you take the final approach path, for safety reasons it has to be 6 nautical miles. That goes over Hammersmith, Chiswick, and the joining point is around sort of Oval at Lambeth. So all those communities there are going to have no choice but to experience a worsening situation, in my view, from the noise. And the biggest concern at the moment is, to go back to the opaqueness point, is there is so much uncertainty because there are potential benefits from modernisation in terms of emissions reductions and potential noise benefits if you can get aircraft up quicker. However, all of those are trade-offs and being based on government policy, which again, ironically in this area, is slightly opaque. And if the policy, as it is now, is to limit the total number of people, you're going to design one set of flight paths that concentrates the noise over existing communities that are already overflown. If you go with a total reduction, you might try and spread the noise around, which I think many of our members would favour, but that does mean new areas are going to get noise. So that may be a more equitable solution, but at the moment it's not clear either what Heathrow want or what the government more specifically want Heathrow to be able to do in terms of their design. So I'm not sure it quite answers the double stacking, but the concentration is where that would occur, I think. So.
Great. I think we need to get that point across more because I think that not many people realise that there's this kind of huge risk coming towards us, whether it's 6 months, 2 years, 4 years. I don't think anybody has any ideas, but this is going to be something that many, many Londoners are going to want to campaign against. So thank you. Is there anybody else who wants to comment on that? You don't have to. Great. I'll ask my specific question. So on to TfL. Can you set out the context for how aviation noise is mapped, please, addressed and managed by different authorities?
Cool. Yes. Yeah, I mean, the challenge is that this is all, aviation is governed by a national framework. So, and it's far from watertight. And it means ultimately that airports can follow the guidance and still it results in significant aviation noise for some of the communities worst affected. And it's a real challenge because if you're trying to, those of us around the table are trying to seek to hold the airports to account, we don't have the tools to do it. And sometimes it feels like the cards are stacked against communities. And there's a whole range of issues. So just to take one of them, the question I think that Bridget raised about the modelling, and it's really frustrating because, so part of it is, what is it you're actually modelling? So to give an example, when Heathrow was taking forward expansion previously, the planning process, they included indicative flight paths. Now, what was really frustrating is that there was no, Heathrow were quite open with this, there was no claim that these flight paths would be the actual flight paths that would result with expansion. But the way that noise and airspace is covered, it's separated from the planning process, so they were entirely within their rights to do that. Now, I think from a community engagement perspective, they could have been more constructive and more helpful and taken forward those. But of course, if they're not required to do that, you can understand why they take that approach. So you then have these sort of airspace. You can clearly say that you put 50% more planes in the sky, these are not going to sort of suddenly just disappear into the ether, you won't hear them, clearly you're going to hear them. But then, of course, it's how you distribute them, and the points that Paul was making about concentration versus dispersal. But it's very hard to get a grip on that when you're looking at these expansion plans, and as part of the process, you're not being given the chance to say, well, actually, who is going to be affected, how are they going to be affected? And then on the other part of it, I think is really important, again, has been touched on, is this question of the metrics. And actually, especially with the advent of new technology, and can talk a bit more about, again, that we've spoken a bit about already, something like performance-based navigation, the concentrated dispersal. No one metric is going to give you a clear picture of the impacts on local communities. In some of the aspects, the average is very important, very useful. Sometimes it's about the individual events, sometimes looking across the whole day, but also looking at particular periods. So, for example, the night, or for example, in some of the plans that London City Airport is taking forward, looking at periods where currently they have no noise at all. So, you know, their current proposal looking at introducing planes for the first time on Saturday afternoon and evening. You need to capture that. You need to look at, okay, what's the impacts in Saturday afternoon and evening. Looking at an average, which is across the whole week, that doesn't make sense. And so unless you have that suite of metrics, you're not going to cover that. And again, the frustration is the guidance you have coming from central government, from the CAA, isn't requiring airports to do that. And that's aside from the fact that it's not keeping up with some of the latest developments in terms of what we're getting for academic research. So the World Health Organization has been doing some really good work on this, and yet a lot of our assessment requirements that come in the national framework are based on things that were which are now quite out of date, and our understanding is much better about the level should be. So that's the sort of the world we live in, and why it is so challenging to try and address some of these.
Is there something that you could send us, really, that we could pass on to? Because I've got a lot of time for the new Secretary of State for Transport. I think she's very proactive, and I'm just wondering if we could come up with some, you know, what we actually want to change, because she's very good at understanding it is. I always remember the sonic boom from Concorde, I'm showing my age here, in the 70s. You knew twice a day you were going to literally have a sonic boom, and if you were literally up a stall in your kitchen when that happens, you could be in trouble. But obviously the world's moved on, but certainly early, as Bridget said, early in the morning, those kind of issues. And I think this average noise issue is rubbish. As you say, if Saturday afternoon's going to be damaged, we should be looking at Saturday afternoon and not the average week. So anything specific you could send that maybe we could, as a committee, look at would be quite useful on that.
Yeah, I mean, we can. I mean, I don't know what we have, which is exactly off the shelf, but we can sort of pull some together based on some of the sort of key concerns that around the existing regulations.
Thank you. And to move on, and now back to Paul and Bridget. From your engagement with both Heathrow, and I should talk about City Airport as well, showing my bias, because obviously I don't represent, and I've never lived anywhere near City Airport. What is the industry doing to manage aircraft noise, including, and I guess this is the main point, technological developments, please?
I'll kick off and then pass to Bridget. The airport at Heathrow certainly is more of my area of expertise. Has a community noise engagement group that meets quarterly, and they've recently appointed an independent chair to that because to help with the governance, which I hope is going to be a step in the right direction. Because historically, when they've made promises and then haven't been delivered, it's been very hard for community groups to get that engagement and to get the promises delivered, or at least some of them. I think the danger is that it gets down into very technical detail very quickly, and for the majority of community members that engage with that is not something they have the time or desire to really necessarily fully understand. So that allows the airport is in a position of power there, because they can dominate the agenda and move it on swiftly when there's something they don't like. However, in my experience, in a couple of years I've been doing this, there are a few commitments that they've sort of endeavoured to undertake, which I'm hoping they will deliver. The question, and I think it's a poor excuse, but the one that they use at the moment is that they have insufficient resources and staff, largely because they laid them all off in the pandemic and they now can't recruit them. But that isn't local communities' problem. That's theirs, and they should sort it out as quickly as possible. And just a point on the technology. In terms of noise, there isn't. There's lots of stuff that's going to happen in decarbonisation, but in noise, there is no step change coming. We've had that already. From the difference between Concorde and jet engines that you've got today. We're talking maybe, and this is industry figures, maybe a decibel reduction in engines over the next decade, so maybe 3 dB over the next 30 years, which is not really perceptible to the human ear on the ground. So there are, I think, operational practices that airlines could be running. So there's a noise abatement procedure 1, which they can use and use often in other airports. It's not used as often as it should be at Heathrow, and that would make a huge difference, particularly on departures for many communities. However, we come back to sort of this gap in the regulation regulation and enforcement, again, is that there is no one body with the authority to make sure that happens. It's down to the airport to issue guidance. The airlines can do it if they want. They've got many other reasons, fuel burn, all the rest of it, why they necessarily won't always do it. So I think that is a real problem, and there's a few other things they could do around continuous descent approach and continuous climb operations as well, where if there was stricter enforcement, we would get benefits to local communities.
Yes, there's a great deal talked about departures, but in fact, the majority of London is under the arrivals flight path. So, and you get westerly winds 70% of the time, so you're getting all of central and east London is hammered by Heathrow 70% of the time. And also we get the arrivals when the wind changes going to city. Recently, Paul and I were at an event, and somebody under the arrivals flight path said he's also noticing departures, which was new, so they're perhaps concentrating those. But what I do know is that amongst most of us who are affected, the level of expertise that we're all supposed to have to understand what's going on is absolutely beyond us. And where most of us just try to get our day done, our jobs done and so on, and then as campaigners to find some time to try and understand, and we're up against people whose day job is just to say no to us the whole time. It's not happening, and no, you're wrong, and no, we can't do this because it's mind-boggling how Heathrow and in fact City, because some colleagues of mine are going to meet Robert Sinclair tomorrow about some noise metrics modelling that they've done on new gen planes that are going to be coming in if city expansion goes ahead. And these planes aren't quieter. They may be slightly less noisy for their size, but nonetheless, they're still making an enormous amount of noise. And Robert Sinclair doesn't believe it, so Tim Walker is going off to argue his corner, because City doesn't come up with facts and figures, which Tim can refute. But he's come up with facts and figures which City is absolutely determined to refute, because it doesn't suit them. I mean, this is the trouble. It doesn't suit them to be questioned. I want to just talk about complaining. I don't know whether anybody was going to ask, but in the early days, I rang up Heathrow in the middle of the night, and I just held my phone up. I said, listen. And the person answering the phone said, gosh, you ought to be on our engagement board. So I got there in the end. I then wrote a letter later on in the year saying, I would like to table about 13,000 noise events that I'm complaining about over this last year. And I got a letter back saying, you've got to table each one separately. You probably need to have a web platform to do it. I thought, you know, I hadn't even got a mobile phone then, so I didn't even know. It's unbelievable. And the Richard West, I can't remember what his
Community
title is.
engagement.
The community engagement came to my house. We had 10 people from the area, and we had somebody from NATS, Dan Foster. They spent, I believe, about half an hour before coming to the meeting, casing the joint and just seeing what was going on. Dan Foster said, gosh, those planes are low. And we didn't know how low these planes were that his team was bringing in over us, 20 miles away from Heathrow. And Richard West said, oh no, they're not low, they're big, as if that was any sort of explanation. And one of our people round the table was a Southwark councillor in his 70s, and he said to these two, I like to have an afternoon nap. Now, the only way I can do that is by wearing ear defenders. And the two of them looked at each other as if, I don't believe it. You know, they couldn't understand there was that level of noise created by them that far away from Heathrow. And this is all the people worry about, the near communities and the noise levels within certain noise contours. And we're outside the noise contour where anybody takes any notice for health reasons or for mitigation reasons. So we don't get any soundproofing, which is about the only thing they can offer. But who wants soundproofing? This is what I ask. I want to have my windows open at night if it's hot. I want to have my windows open at night anyway for fresh air. And I want to sit outside and enjoy my little garden or my balcony or whatever it might be. And all these things are denied. So, we've got a noise monitor. We finally got a noise monitor. And when I asked for the report, Heathrow team, Anderson Acoustics, produced something. It took about a year to produce. And then I said to the CAA, what are you doing about the data? And they said, or Darren Rhodes said, their noise expert, said, oh, it's set too high or it's too low, so we can't use the data. And I mean, who's setting these levels? And are they doing it intentionally to fox us? Anyway, so these are just little things from a very unprofessional person who...
May I just very quickly, just the last bit of question about that technology and a really important principle, which I think encapsulates some of this, which is there are technological improvements, and I think it's really welcome. And there can be questions about how much, whether the amount reductions are as big as you expect. But then the really question, Paul, is who benefits from that? So if you have aircraft, you know, again, question about how much aircraft, so this noisy and they're going to this noisy, what do you do with that benefit? Do you say that benefit accrues to the local communities who have been suffering for years, or, as what seems to happen, use that to justify a commensurate increase in planes? So they say, look, oh, we're not increasing the noise. Well, yes, but actually what you're doing is you're taking the technical benefits and entirely banking them to encourage, to allow more flights. I mean, say London Plan Policy T8, we've been really clear that the benefits should be shared between the industry and with local communities. There needs to be a meaningful dialogue, and recognising sometimes the questions are not straightforward. So taking something, for example, like glide slopes, where there's the combination of, you know, allowing more flights, noise, but then sometimes also carbon, where actually it's not straightforward. If you have a steeper glide slope, it's better for noise because you get the aircraft away from residents more quickly, but it does have carbon implications. So there's some really, it's not, these are difficult questions, but there does need to be a meaningful dialogue. What you can't just do is say, we're going to do these things and make this more efficient, allow more aircraft, and, you know, the residents just have to put up with that. That seems a really bad use of technology.
Thank you. My last question, which I don't think I really need to ask, is are you content with how they have engaged with you? So all I'd say, I don't even going to ask that question because I think that we've got the answer to that question. All I'd say is the one thing I do disagree with Bridget about when she talked about, you know, not being qualified. You're being incredibly modest. I find that Londoners and the residents that we have the honour of representing are usually, and dare I say this because I'll get told off by my colleagues to the left, to the right here perhaps, but don't always believe in experts. I like experts sometimes, but experts are not always right, and you guys are doing a fantastic job. Thank you for what you do. Please do use the London Assembly. We both, as political parties, have transport full-time researchers who we can put on these issues to support you, support us, to help you, and we're always happy to do so. And use social media because it is about campaigning. And, you know, I think I've been fighting Heathrow since the 1970s personally, and I'm happy to continue. So I'll hand on to the next question to you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. I do think we need to listen to community voices and scientists and experts. I just wanted to say that. Also, I just wanted to point out to anyone watching and to our guests that the airports were invited to send representatives. In fact, we strongly encouraged them to send representatives. We were told that no one was available. We will continue to try in the future as well. And I will remain my impartiality and leave it at that. Assemblymember Bukhari.
Now, I'm just checking that I was supposed to start at 20, but I can start at 19. That's absolutely fine. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Do you want to do it? Or? No, go ahead. Okay. Great. So, Paul and Bridget, there has been actually in 2019 a committee published. The committee actually published a report on aircraft noise with recommendations around overlapping flight paths and flight altitude. Have you engaged with Heathrow and City on these issues? And if so, what was their response?
We've tried to, and I think they're both willing individually. The problem is that City is a bit further advanced in the development of its new flight paths and its expansion plans than Heathrow, because Heathrow had to scrap everything it had done for associated with a third runway and start again on a second runway. So I think that there's a willingness there potentially to meet, but the time frames at the moment aren't aligning, and so that's causing a problem, because for areas like Bridget's described where you've got those overlapping planes, it's particularly noisy and is likely to get worse from both airports.
I think Paul has answered it absolutely perfectly. But I would say that they're not actually trying terribly hard to work together. As it happens, talking to my colleague Tim, who is meeting City tomorrow, he has argued all the way, we can't talk about expansion until we've got our flight paths sorted out. So the fact that they're a leap ahead of Heathrow means that there's never going to be any coordination. And I just remember from previous consultation to do with, if I can find it, Airspace and Future Operations consultation document, which came out. The deadline for applying was the 3rd of April 2019. They didn't even know where, Heathrow didn't even know where its flight paths were going to be, so it was impossible really to respond to anything. And if City's up against all of that, then what hope is there, quite honestly?
There is a body that's an industry-led body which is now government-funded, but called ACOG, so it's the Airspace Coordination Organisation Group, it's a change coordination group, and that's supposed to be coordinating all of the airports. So there's 21 in total across the country. All of the London airports are involved in that for the South East, and there is a deadline point in sort of 2025 where the master plan is saying all of these airports should all be aligned. However, I think you're going to be waiting for Heathrow to catch up with everybody else on that particular time frame. So they might be worth inviting along with the airports to your next session.
Okay, we'll add that to the list. Thank you. Shamal, we're going to talk a little bit about the expansion of the proposed expansion of Heathrow and City Airport's impact on noise, particularly in terms of the number of new flights and the effect on flight paths. How do the airports plan to mitigate the noise impacts from expansion? What have you heard from them?
So on the case of Heathrow, obviously the challenge is that everything is currently paused. So for the moment, there's nothing active going on. I think a lot of it touches things we've talked about previously. A lot was being placed on new technology, on things you can do with flight path performance-based navigation. But as has been said, the flight paths they consulted on were indicative. They made no pretense that what they were consulting on in the last round of consultation was actually what was going to be flown. Trying to get a meaningful grip on it is very difficult. I think some of the comments about mitigation are also well made. So some of the schools in the local area near Heathrow have been given these igloos where they can play, but in the same way as people don't want to live in homes with the windows closed, kids would quite like to run around and not necessarily hide in these large things, however fun they might be for a little bit. There's lots of elements. Likewise, the proposals for... I would say the threshold for Heathrow expansion for providing full mitigation, the noise threshold is too high. And so a lot of homes which would be affected wouldn't be covered. But there are also concerns about when you look at the past evidence of previous mitigation schemes for residential homes, that the take-up is quite limited, because what often happens is it's a commitment to providing X% single supplier doesn't necessarily mean that the homes then affected can then find the money to make that happen. Yeah, there are very serious concerns, but the fundamental problem is we just don't know. The few things we do know, there are going to be a 50% increase in aircraft. Having a third runway will have an impact on respite. What goes on further away from the airport is unknown, because that depends on how they do the concentration of dispersal. But on the areas approaching the airport, at the moment, they're guaranteed half of the day they will have no flights across. You can't do that with 3 runways. The way they're proposing, you would get that would go down to 25% of the day, effectively for most of those communities. So, yeah, for Heathrow expansion, there are very serious challenges. They have a chance to go back and make some real improvements if they come back with expansion. But that's again the challenge is where is the pressure for that coming from? At the moment, that isn't coming from central government, from the CAA, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, they did give us some written answers this morning, and they've mentioned things like steeper approaches, etc. They've also mentioned a code of construction practice to reduce the noise, and a noise insulation for eligible properties, and a noise envelope as well. Which actually means that there would be a set of legally binding and enforceable limits and controls to manage noise in the future while allowing the airport to grow. How does that work? And is that actually possible? And I can see you nodding
please.
as well. Yeah, please come in. Please come in.
So lots of airports now are doing the noise envelope. I think there's some legal, I think, reason for. I don't have that background, but Heathrow had got quite a long way with their noise envelope as part of the expansion, and they got they had some communities, the airlines. It's a very broad range of stakeholders who all have interests in the airport, and it really sets up rules for sort of how you're going to operate the airport, how you're going to deal with the reductions. It talks to Shamal's point about if the noise, you know, if you get technological advances, what happens in the community. So it's really a forum and a way of setting out some sort of rules of engagement would be my take on it, as to how you can do the business. And of course Heathrow want to expand, they want to grow the business, and the communities definitely don't want that. And so it's sort of setting out the rules. And I think one thing else that sort of Heathrow, that fed into that envelope, was that Heathrow did do some early work in the expansion, asking communities about these really tricky issues, like, do you want to share noise? Do you want to concentrate it? And they actually did get some steer from the communities on those issues we grapple with that are really not that simple, about whether you newly expose people and things like that. So yeah, noise envelope's complex.
Certainly in Camberwell, we weren't invited to engage in whether we wanted to share noise or not. We were outside that envelope that's being discussed. When we eventually did get some information, which I presented at the Community Council, having talked to Heathrow, I said, you mean we're not actually going to get any break from noise at all? Because we had 3 envelopes, that sort of south and then, 20 past and then quarter past. And it was going to go down in that quarter swathe, backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. And anybody who's been under a flight path without needing to understand how noise actually works as a physics, the noise goes like this. So if you then move your next quarter, you've still got the left flank of noise coming over you, and the people on the next quarter over. I'm not being at all scientific, but anyway, as the flight path changes to its next noise envelope, you've still got a bit of noise in the first envelope, but it's not overhead. But you don't have a break. It may be just a bit less, but it's still there. I'd also like to say that in Southwark and further out, you don't actually get half a day's respite. They all line up over Southwark, and then when they get closer in towards Hammersmith is when they then go to the north or the south runway. So we don't get any sort of break. And even if they're supposed to fly over higher than 4,000 feet, a lot of them don't. And the decibel levels are huge. They are in the 60s, sometimes 70s, and particularly in the quieter hours, as I've described in the morning and late at night. During the day, they'd like to say you've got background noise, so that sort of hides it. Well, the concentration actually doesn't hide the background noise. You're just aware that the planes are coming right over you. And local councillors came to my garden to discuss taking a tree down, and they looked up and said, I don't believe there are that many planes. I've never seen so many planes coming over. I didn't realise we had this problem. This was in probably 2017, 2018. It became a problem just over a certain swathe. And the idea is whether you bother a lot of people a little or you bother a few people all the time seems entirely the wrong balance. Because if you could sort out perhaps between 4 and 6 planes an hour over the whole of London, all Londoners would be able to cope with those few events per hour. But to get up to, in one case when we did a counting exercise, there were as many as 50 planes an hour coming over. I was doing a count exercise. There were 43. I was standing in Burgess Park. 43 planes were coming over at 11 o'clock in the morning. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there were 47. CAA disputed my counts, which is fine because I was just doing 5-bar gates, so I don't mind being 1 or 2 out. But nonetheless, there was no significant difference between the morning and the afternoon.
Thank you. Sorry, carry on.
Then there was something else. Expansion hasn't got to mean an extra runway. It means getting more planes using the existing runways, and that's what we're really up against. They may not lift the cap on planes. They may have more bigger planes holding more people, and those bigger planes make more noise. Whether the technology is going to exist as we get progressively greener by, jet zero by 2050, ho-ho, remains to be seen whether you can get such huge planes carrying so many people. But
Bridget, you mentioned that those times, and it's interesting because Sarah Olney, who's the MP for Richmond, yes, she actually wrote to the Transport Secretary in July, actually specifically stating those particular times between 11:30 4:30, she said in her letter. But there's this fear that there's a relaxation from the government that wants to make sure that flight quotas to ease their stress and to allow these flights to happen. I mean, obviously, now with the expansion, or this proposed expansion as well, are both you, Paul and Bridget, do you think that this is just going to add to even maybe new homes and residents that could be impacted by the new flights?
It may well be, but if they get it a little rather than all the time, I don't think one can help that. As somebody was saying, Neil, who was talking about the underground and representing a group of people, mostly in social housing, you're prepared to put up with a certain amount by choosing to live in a city. But what you're not expecting is to be visited by noise that you never had before. And a point that he made that has also been made by residents around London City is that somebody living in social housing or whatever one calls it, made a fuss to the council and said, it's too noisy for me, could you please find me somewhere else? They said, sorry, we haven't got anywhere else. You're on your own if you can't cope here, which is exactly what Neil was saying. People are nervous about making a fuss, so they don't. And Southwark and Lewisham, particularly, that I'm aware of, have great swathes of people living in accommodation where they're not in a position to make a great deal of fuss. I was very fortunate that I had somewhere I could go to, which was leaving London. But I'm sorry to have had to have left to be forced out rather than to go when it suited me. And I feel a great deal of responsibility, having got involved in campaigning, that there's nobody really talking about arrivals over southeast London. There's a lot of worry closer to the airport about departures, and I'm not... no noise is worse or better than any other noise. It's grim for wherever you are, and you don't need to, I don't know anything about departure noise, but I'm really sorry for people who have a hideous time. In the same way that I'm really sorry for people who have a hideous time under arrivals. And we met somebody, again, Paul and I, at the same event about 3 weeks ago, and he and his wife had just moved in, and he said, I lie in bed at 4 o'clock knowing the plane is going to come over. He'd only bought a house a year ago. Poor fellow had absolutely no idea what he was moving into. And as I've heard said before, when you're looking at a house to buy, you're certainly not looking at 4 o'clock in the morning to see what's going on. You're there at 2 in the afternoon or, 10 in the morning. So what you hear is what you're prepared to take on board. But
just to pick up, I think you were referring to Sarah Olney's letter was around night flights, and what we've seen certainly in the last 5 or 6 months is a huge increase in what's called late running operations. So there's meant to be a hard stop at 11:30, no arrivals after that point. but we're seeing it regularly now. It used to be maybe in an average year, 50 out of 365 days, you'd get 50 days where that happened. It's probably happening almost on a daily occurrence now, and it's also happening at a higher volume than previously. So I think there was a couple of weeks ago where we had 25 between 11:30 and 1:30 arrivals, and that is, that's done governed under DFT's night flights regime. There are certain dispensations that the airport is allowed to give airlines for weather or VIPs coming in, heads of state, for example. However, there is no transparency about that decision making, and I don't understand why in 2022 that cannot be simply placed onto a website that says flight X delayed from Malaga or wherever it was because of poor weather, and that would help communities a lot, because it's not the community's fault that the flight's been delayed for whatever reason, but they're the ones who suffer the noise. And when you then get your early morning arrivals at 4:30 coming in, you might have had 8 hours. WHO says good night's sleep. These people are maybe getting free on some occasions, and that's just not acceptable in the modern day and age when it's completely preventable. And I appreciate aircraft once they're in the sky have to land, but maybe there needs to be stricter regulation about whether they take off in the first place. You can look at the example of Frankfurt, where there is a hard stop at 11. There are no night flights past 11. The first one comes in at 7 a.m. I think. So you've got they've got that period. Now, granted, they got a fourth runway out of that, so I wouldn't want to make that compromise at Heathrow. But there are ways of managing it in a different way.
Thank you so much, both of you. You are so articulate about this, and I can imagine the impact that it's having on you. Just campaigning must be so hard on you. So I really do appreciate everything that you've said today. I'm just going to go back to TfL and the mayor's impact on this. What levers does he have? And I know that you talked about the frustration already about this, and particularly around the future of planning application of City Airport. Are there any additional powers that the mayor may have to plan to address the noise pollution caused by aviation? And I do know that his approach to aviation noise is that he is against expansion. He does want reduced noise flights, airspace modernisation, but he also mentioned an independent noise regulator. So I'd like to know a little bit more about that.
It sounds like I won't be the only one with comments to say about that. Yeah, I mean, this is the challenge. The mayor's formal powers are very limited. Effectively, the GLA Act allows him to be consulted on certain issues, but for the most part, not much more than that. We do respond to a whole range of consultations in terms of expansion, in terms of airspace, and we've done that for the recent consultations at City, for example, at airports outside the Greater London boundary. Obviously, the mayor has a formal planning role in terms of the airports within London, but again, with constraints. So as soon as it's a national project, so Heathrow expansion would be taken forward as a development consent order because it is a nationally significant infrastructure project. The mayor will be able to make representations. The London plan and mayor's transport strategy will be documents that have to be taken into account, but they will not be the primary documents. So he can use his influence and use his lobbying, and we can use the technical backing to provide that. London City, I think it's likely the application mechanism they're going to use, for example, for their growth plans will mean that Newham is the primary decision-making body as the host authority. I think the mayor, to be confirmed, might still be able to direct Newham, but obviously that can still be called in by central government. So that's we do what we can with the tools we have, but recognise that they are limited. I think the other particular say that it's a shame the CAA wasn't able to come because they hold a lot of the influence in particularly the day-to-day operations, maybe, and less so expansion. But yeah, on the independent noise regulator, I think because what's very clear, there's for so long I think local communities have been taken for granted, and there's this understandable lack of trust. And I think sometimes the instinct from the industry is a little bit, well, they're always going to say no, so let's not engage with them. And that's, of course, really frustrating because actually we can, there is common ground to be had if you engage constructively. An independent noise regulator could really play that role. Now, the government did set up the ICCAN. I can, yeah, indeed. I would please, for one of you can remind me what it stands for. And I think one of the challenges, it wasn't what we had asked for because it was effectively part of the CAA arm's length-ish. But actually the biggest challenge was time limited. And they had powers to make suggestions, but they had no binding enforcement. You look at it again, it's worth looking at what other countries do, and other countries, there are noise regulators who can impose fines. And in Paris, for example, I believe they have that. They can set very clear restrictions. Having a regulator whose job is to sort of say nice words, make some nice recommendations, but ultimately doesn't have the tools itself to influence, isn't going to be the powerful independent arbiter that's going to solve this. So yeah, it's still...
So that hasn't happened then?
That hasn't happened, no.
Yeah.
Not.
How can we make that happen? What can the Mayor do to make that happen? What do we need to do to get that action?
Go on, Paul, yeah, you want to...
We need it on a statutory footing. The recommendation from the Airports Commission to set up an independent noise ombudsman was to have it on a statutory footing, as Shamar's just said, with legal powers of to fine and enforce. And the previous Secretary of State for Transport and Infinite Wisdom decided it was a good idea to abolish ICANN, despite because it had only been funded for 2 years. I think because he's an amateur pilot himself and he didn't really like what it was doing, but. It was annoying the airlines, it was annoying the communities and what it was doing. So it probably had the balance about right in the work stream it was doing. But actually, it was fighting a battle with one hand tied behind its back. So yeah, you need statute. In a similar way, you've got the Climate Change Committee. You need a noise ombudsman placed on that footing, and then probably need to make aircraft noise a statutory nuisance. If I was in charge, that's what I'd be doing. And it would actually give legal recourse to communities to take action.
Yeah, could I say that Matthew Pennycook, the MP for Greenwich, did indeed ask that question. And one of the complaints that came into us from somebody in Woolwich, who is a key worker, said, we can complain about road traffic, we can complain about trains and the underground, but we can't complain about aeroplane noise.
You mentioned lobbying. So how has that worked out for the Mayor? The engagement with Heathrow is challenging. So how has that engagement worked with Heathrow and city airports on noise?
I mean, it's a tricky one. Because we do need to engage with them. They have an important role in our city on a whole range of issues. So there are meetings, particularly at Heathrow, meetings at all levels. The Mayor has met John Holland-Kay, the Chief Executive of Heathrow, right down to officer level, and I have contact with people at Heathrow, and then there are other formal channels, consultations when there are proposals taken forward, and we raise a range of issues, and the noise issues get raised whenever the opportunity arises and there's a suitable sort of forum for doing that. But it is one, and I think like the resident groups, we can keep banging the drum publicly, privately, seek to influence how they do things. But there are limits, as long as effectively the government and CAA are not pushing the same pressure and not creating a framework, it's a sort of nice to have for them rather than something they actually have to confront. And that's a challenge. So we will continue to do that because it's really important we do that and represent Londoners. But yeah, we can't force some of those outcomes.
Thank you so much. We're going to just slightly move on to the last question, which is slightly different, but same issue. And to you, Shamal, what progress has the Mayor made on addressing the impacts of helicopter noise specifically on Londoners?
Yeah, and sorry to sound a broken record. I mean, the same issues which affect sort of aircraft noise equally apply to helicopters. In some ways more so. We have a regime which is out of date, not really fit for purpose, and it's a national sort of regime, and we've had conversations with CA in the past. It's worth maybe just saying a little bit about the CA's role. They are the independent regulator. They work within a framework from government. I do think sometimes they could interpret their remit more proactively. Sometimes the comment is, well, we need to wait for government to give us the steer. The biggest challenge with the CA is that their main requirements are around efficiency and safety. Safety, of course, that's really, really important, and efficiency, which translates into making the system work well and supporting the capacity. And that's all great, but the environment often plays very much a second-tier priority. So sometimes we want to say, well, actually, you need to move focus on that. They say, well, the government needs to give us that steer. And so that's the overall context. And I think the CA does have an important role to play and could play it much more effectively. So at helicopter noise, there is a regime. There is more restrictions on single-engine helicopters, on where they go. The rules governing helicopters with more engines, they can pretty much go where they like. And that's the rule. And it's sort of And the other, the rules, there are the paths where the single-engine helicopter go are, in theory, meant to be places where there are fewer residential areas. But this, I don't know how many, we're talking decades ago that this was put in place. London has seen a lot of development in the last 30, 40 years. So those rules are not even, those corridors don't make any sense anymore, because the idea that there are parts of London with less, which are less developed, never mind the fact they don't even apply to all helicopters. So that's the starting point. And we've made representations and have to say got very little interest in doing anything about it, even though this is there. So the one thing the Mayor does have control over is, or some control over, is what happens on the ground. So again, London Plan Policy T8 is very clear that we support no new heliports in London. There is one on the Thames, and I know the local authorities there, local communities, have a lot of frustrations about the noise that generates and the traffic along the river they go to and from that. So at least there are things the Mayor can do to stop making that any worse in terms of allowing more heliports. But in terms of what's going on in the sky, it can be a little bit like banging one's head against a brick wall with the CAA.
Thank you. Can I just take the question on helicopters to Paul and Bridget as well? Because I've been speaking to the Aviation Environment Federation and campaigners. I know in America they've got Block the Chop, I think. So there's more a tradition of campaigning against helicopter noise. Is it something you've come across or something you're doing work on?
It does come up from our members. It's certainly less of an issue. I think people tend to be focused on the aircraft, but it's becoming, I think, an increasing one, because there seem to be more helicopters operating in the skies over London, and there's even less regulation about how they operate. I think people sort of maybe are more accustomed to it, in that it's they sort of assume that it's for something important when you see a helicopter, rather than an aircraft is a commercial operation, but it's purely more private operations. The other one I'm getting quite a lot of now is stuff around the growth of private airfields, so general aviation airfields and use of private jets, and you've seen quite a decrease in business traffic at airports like Heathrow, but a massive increase at airports like Norfolk, which is becoming an increasing problem. And of course, there's noise implications of that, but a private jet is 12 times more polluting from a carbon perspective than a commercial one, so there's a huge climate change issues there as well, which our members do care about as well.
Thank you. I think that's the key point on helicopters, that I think I presumed that, so I used to live in central London, if there were protests you'd hear helicopters all the time for hours and hours, but actually a lot of the time it's not police helicopters, it could be private helicopters and someone going on holiday somewhere. Bridget?
And it's also hospital emergencies.
True.
King's College has got a second platform for helicopters to arrive during the night. And we did hear from a nurse, and she said, I just have to think we're doing good, so I try and not mind being woken up at night.
So just on that, Bridget, if I could ask you, Shamal, is there good, reliable data about what helicopters are in the air for around London?
No, I think we've looked into this, tried to get some of this before. There isn't, because it isn't particularly well sort of managed in the framework, so that there isn't. I mean, the one thing I would say is you cite the US example. I think the difference is that, for all the annoyance, where we have nowhere near the level of helicopter flights they have in the US, and our job is at least not to try and make sure that doesn't get any worse, but that doesn't take away from the noise impacts that you have already on those who are affected, and yeah, they're affected a lot.
Okay, that makes sense. And just a final question from me, unless anyone else has any other questions. We've been talking a lot today about reducing flights and the need to do that to reduce noise. Is the Mayor and his team looking at frequent flyer levy at all as a way of reducing flights?
I think, there's a general question obviously around carbon, and I think has been said. The Mayor has taken a very clear position that he doesn't, at the moment, there is no justification for any sort of growth in aviation capacity, given the climate emergency. And I think the next question then is, okay, and what are the different levers? And I think that's one that is very much being put on the table. I think recognising that there are also a number of practical challenges in implementing something like that, and you'd need to make sure there weren't any perverse consequences, there weren't any loopholes. And I think that's why, to my knowledge, it hasn't been implemented anywhere else in the world. But I do think we need to think creatively about how we not just put the restrictions, but how we also change behaviour so that people are flying less. So, for example, using rail and so on.
Yeah, I applaud that you're saying there won't be any growth in aviation, but I often make this point, as so many people do, but London could be a global leader on this. Are there plans to reduce the amount of aviation that we have already and to put that pressure on there and to lobby for a frequent flyer levy?
I think the biggest, again, this is because it's a national policy prerogative. The government consulted after a delay of at least a year on its aviation carbon policy. I think it was hugely frustrating because it basically said, if you look at all the things in place, there's no need for proactive action. And actually, when they talked about net zero, what it actually meant was a reduction, but then relying on decarbonisation of other industries to then get you to zero. And I think the response that came from City Hall was very, very clear. That is not good enough. And there are a number of levers, and looking at those, I think a really good example, and actually someone who is taking the lead is, as we've seen in the Netherlands, there is a proposal for Schiphol, and they've come up with an arbitrary figure that they're going to cut 70,000 from the cap of flights to Schiphol. Now, this has caused huge uproar, and it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. In some ways, the challenge is that you really want to see efforts coordinated across different countries so it doesn't become this competitive game, because everyone in Europe should be doing that and looking at what are we doing proactively to try and address this and say, okay, first of all, that's, we have no growth, but actually what we need to be doing to reducing the carbon impacts of aviation. And the big concern is a lot of, the government policy at the moment and a lot of others are focused on the technology gains, and that's not going to be the panacea. But I think the next step is to wait for, when there is a government which has time to look at this, to wait for a final aviation carbon strategy and see what policy direction they're taking, because it will be ultimately in the government's hands, but we will continue to put the pressure on government to deal with this properly.
Thank you very much. I like the idea of a competitive game around the world to reduce aviation as fast as possible, and we'll see who the government is by the time we finish this meeting. But Assembly Member Best.
Thanks, Chair. And I just wanted to raise, it's an interesting point around frequent flying levies, but I think perhaps there would be a degree of conflict for the Mayor who thinks it's necessary to fly to Argentina with his team for a virtual meeting. So perhaps we could do better by setting an example.
Hear, hear.
Point well made, I suppose. Bridget, I'll give you the final comment.
Oh, well, I'll use it to make two.
Okay.
One is on the frequent flyer levy. In fact, the firm, the Society of Chartered Accountants, or whatever its proper name is, responded that it'd be perfectly easy to implement a frequent flyer levy. Looking at their consultation response, it makes jolly good reading. And the other thing is, what about drones? We may have fewer planes, but who's going to regulate how drones fly and how noisy they're going to be? And they're jolly good for delivering medicine to out-of-the-way places. But what happens if you just fancy pizza at midnight and you're in a built-up area? Are you going to have boxes sort of being dropped and noisy little devices buzzing all the way through the night? I know it's not aircraft noise, but it's something else going through the air, which is all part of the airspace modernisation design being involved.
I think you articulate it really well, and it's something the Aviation Environment Federation said also, that if all the Deliveroos or other providers are out there all turn into drones, how noisy will that be buzzing around us? I fear that may be a future committee meeting, as it's probably staring us in the face for our future. But on that happy note, thank you all very much for your contributions today. That was a tremendously interesting session and full of good information. We've got a few more items of business to attend to. You're welcome to stay or you're welcome to leave as well, but thank you all very much for your contribution. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion?
Noted.
Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion?
Yes.
Environment Committee work programme. Can I ask the committee to note its work programme?
Noted.
Thank you. The next meeting of the Environment Committee is scheduled for 10th of November 2022 at 10 a.m. in the Chambers City Hall. I have no urgent business, which concludes today's meeting. Thank you.